The dog broke formation before anyone moved. 1 second, the German Shepherd was standing at rigid military attention beside his handler. The next, he had crossed 12 feet of restricted ceremony ground and was pressing his muzzle against the palm of a woman nobody in the crowd could name. A nurse. Plain scrubs, no rank insignia, standing near the edge of the Silver Creek Military Medical Center's retirement stage like she'd wandered in from the wrong building. The commander's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Ma'am, this area is restricted." She didn't flinch, didn't step back, just looked at him with calm brown eyes that had seen something much worse than a ceremony gone sideways. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The dog made a sound, not a bark, not a whimper, something between recognition and relief. And every senior officer on that stage went very, very still. Before you go any further, if this story already has you hooked, please subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very end. Hit like and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it really began. The ceremony had started clean. Silver Creek Military Medical Center sat at the edge of a flat Colorado plain where the wind came off the mountains with enough force to knock a folding chair sideways, and someone had made the mistake of setting up the retirement stage directly in its path. 3 rows of metal chairs were already listing slightly to the left by the time the honor guard assembled, and a junior enlisted soldier had been quietly chasing a program pamphlet across the grass for the past 4 minutes. Lena Whitmore noticed these things because noticing things was the only habit she'd never been able to break. She stood near the outer edge of the ceremony ground, close enough to watch, far enough to stay invisible, which was exactly how she preferred it. The Silver Creek badge clipped to her scrub pocket read, "Nursing Staff" in block letters, and that was everything most people needed to know about her. She'd had it that way for almost 3 years. Quiet. Peripheral. Contained. The problem was the dog. His name, according to the retirement program she'd picked up at the entrance, was Sergeant Major Dax, formerly assigned to the 3rd Special Forces Group, 11 years of service, 14 confirmed operational deployments, 2 combat injuries. He was a Belgian Malinois, smaller than people always expected, with a dark muzzle going slightly silver now, and one ear that sat fractionally lower than the other because of scar tissue nobody talked about in official documents. Lena knew exactly which scar. She'd sutured the underlying muscle tissue herself in a forward operating base in a country she was no longer authorized to name at 2 in the morning with inadequate light and a handler who was screaming in the doorway because he thought his dog was going to die. Dax had not died, but apparently his memory was considerably better than hers had hoped. He'd spotted her from 30 feet away. She could trace the exact moment it happened, watching his posture change mid-stride during the procession, watching his nose come up and his gaze lock. His current handler, a young specialist named Briggs, who looked about 24 and deeply uncertain, had tried to correct the deviation with a leash tug. Dax had ignored it. Dax had walked directly to her, and now an entire military retirement ceremony had paused to look at a woman in scrubs who was pressing her fingertips against the top of an old dog's head and trying very hard not to let her expression do anything complicated. "Ma'am." The commander, she'd read his name in the program, Colonel Aldrich Voss, Silver Creek commanding officer, the kind of man who pressed his uniform with aggressive precision, stepped forward from the stage. "I need you to step back behind the perimeter markers." "I heard you," Lena said. Then, "He came to me." She said it simply, not confrontationally. "I wasn't anywhere near the restricted line." Voss looked at Briggs. Briggs looked like he wanted the flat Colorado ground to open and swallow him. Dax was still pressed against Lena's hand, his tail moving in slow, deliberate sweeps. "Sergeant Briggs, get your dog." "Sir, I've been—" Briggs tugged the leash again. Dax didn't move. "I'm trying, sir." There was a ripple of sound from the seated crowd. Not quite laughter, not quite discomfort, somewhere in between. Up on the stage, a cluster of senior medical staff had turned to watch. Lena recognized most of them. Dr. Warren Holst, the hospital director, silver-haired and square-shouldered, with the particular expression of a man who had decided his irritation was a form of authority. Beside him, Chief Nursing Officer Patrice Doyle, who had once told Lena, in the break room while pouring herself a coffee, that nursing staff had no business attending functions above their clearance level. Lena had not pointed out, at the time, that clearance levels worked differently than Patrice believed. Briggs, Voss's voice dropped half a register. Now. Sir, he won't. Let me. Lena crouched down slightly, brought her other hand up, and placed 2 fingers just behind Dax's left ear. A specific point, a specific pressure. She said something quietly, not in English. Dax sat. He stayed sitting, but his gaze didn't leave her face. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. Voss stared at her for a moment. What did you just say to him? The word for wait, Lena said. He responds to check commands. He always has. How would you know that? She handed the leash back to Briggs and straightened up. Because someone trained him that way. She took 1 step backward, back behind the perimeter marker, and folded her hands in front of her and watched the ceremony restart with the particular patience of a person who has learned to let a lot of things go unremarked. The trouble started in the afternoon during the K9 demonstration. It had been scheduled as a post-ceremony event. Standard public affairs optics, handler and dog working an obstacle course while families and medical staff watched from a roped-off viewing area. Briggs was running Dax through a search pattern, methodically, by the book. The way you do when you've learned the protocol and followed it faithfully without quite understanding what the protocol is for. Lena was at the edge of the viewing area, not because she'd planned to stay this long, but because she'd started her shift at 6 in the morning and her feet hurt, and the folding chairs were closer than the walk back to the building. She had a paper cup of bad coffee and a general intention to leave in 5 minutes. She watched Dax work the search pattern. She watched Briggs watch Dax, and she watched Briggs miss it. It was subtle. Most people would have missed it. Dax's head came up off the ground-level search track and swung left, and his tail dropped about 15 degrees, and he made 1 small lateral step that had nothing to do with the demonstration route. It was a signal. It was a specific, trained, meaningful signal, and it meant there was something wrong in the direction he'd just looked, and it meant Briggs should stop and pay attention. Briggs gave a forward command. Dax went forward, but his body was wrong. Low and stiff in the shoulder, the way he went when he was forced to override an alert. Lena set her coffee down on the chair beside her and walked to the rope barrier. The thing about watching someone ignore a working dog's signal is that it creates a kind of specific cognitive pressure. You know what you're watching, and you know what the consequences of it are. And the part of your brain that spent years making time-critical decisions keeps trying to run the numbers whether you want it to or not. He flagged left, she said. To nobody in particular. The woman beside her, a civilian family member, probably, glanced over. Sorry? The dog flagged left 30 seconds ago. There's something over there. She said it quietly, not to start anything, just because the thought needed somewhere to go. Briggs called Dax back for a reset, and as he turned, Dax swung hard left again, this time with more urgency, enough that Briggs had to physically pull the leash to correct it. Lena stepped over the rope. She was aware, the moment she did it, that this was not something she was supposed to do. She was nursing staff. She had a badge that said so. The rope barrier existed precisely to keep nursing staff and civilian guests, and everyone who was not a military dog handler out of the demonstration zone. She stepped over it anyway, crossed the grass in about 8 seconds, and came up on Briggs's right side. Excuse me, Briggs started. He's trying to show you something. She kept her voice even, non-escalating. Left, 40 feet, possibly behind the equipment trailer. He's flagged it twice. Briggs stared at her. Who are you? I work in the hospital. I'm watching your dog. She glanced at Dax, who had turned to look at her with the focused attention of an animal who recognizes someone who actually speaks his language. He's not off pattern. He's on a pattern you're not seeing. There was a pause that lasted maybe 4 seconds, which is long when a working dog is staring at you with unresolved task energy. Briggs looked at Dax. He looked where Dax was looking. He made a decision that was probably less about protocol and more about the fact that Dax's whole body was practically vibrating with suppressed alert behavior, and he gave the track command, the one that meant follow the scent to source. Dax went left. He went straight to the gap between the equipment trailer and the perimeter fence, and he sat, clean, sharp alert position, and from 30 feet away even Lena could see the shape of what was wedged into the space. A bag. Unattended. Not military issued. It turned out to be a civilian contractor's tool bag, left behind from the morning setup crew. nothing dangerous. But the security sweep that followed was not nothing, and neither was the fact that a trained military working dog had flagged it correctly twice and been overridden twice until someone with no official standing in the situation walked across a rope barrier and said something. Lena was back on the public side of the rope by the time the security sergeant finished the sweep and filed his report. She was picking up her cold coffee when she heard the footsteps behind her. "You need to explain yourself." Warren Holst did not use the word please as a general practice. He was standing at full height, which in Holst's terms meant slightly puffed up, shoulders rolled back with the bearing of a man who had once attended 2 military medicine conferences and considered it foundational experience. Patrice Doyle was 3 steps behind him, holding a tablet and looking like she was deciding whether to take notes. Lena turned around. "Explain what, Dr. Holst?" "You crossed a restricted line. You interfered with a military demonstration. You inserted yourself into a security situation without authorization or qualification." He had a list quality to the way he spoke, like he'd drafted the sentence beforehand. "This is exactly the kind of boundary violation I've been trying to address with the nursing department." The dog flagged an unattended bag twice. The handler missed both signals. "I said something." "You have no training that qualifies you to read a military working dog." She looked at him. Not challenging, not defensive, just looking. The way you look at a statement that is so incorrect it takes a moment to locate where the error begins. "That's the position you want to take?" she asked. "It's not a position, it's a fact. Your personnel file is on record. You're a civilian nurse with a community college clinical certification and 4 years of hospital floor experience. Nothing in your background qualifies you for what you just did." Patrice had opened a screen on her tablet. She held it slightly angled, like she wanted Holst to know she was prepared to document things. "You need to leave the ceremony grounds," Holst said, "and you'll need to come to my office Monday morning." Lena considered about 6 different responses. She settled on silence, set her coffee cup in a nearby trash bin, and walked back toward the hospital building. She did not, as she walked, look back at Dax. She didn't need to. She could hear him. A single bark, short and declarative, the way he'd always communicated the end of a successful search. He had found what he was looking for. So had she, probably. She just didn't know yet what it was going to cost her. Oh. The Monday meeting was at 8, which meant Lena had a weekend to think about it. She used most of it working. She was covering a double on the trauma floor Saturday, which gave her enough to concentrate on that the ceremony replayed only in background loops rather than full foreground. The floor was heavy. 2 post-surgical complications, 1 emergency admission after a training exercise went sideways, and a soldier came in with a fractured wrist and a concussion, and a long stretch around midnight where she and a doctor named Prakash sat in the hallway and ate vending machine crackers, and agreed that the hospital's night staffing model was optimistic to the point of fantasy. "You were at the ceremony yesterday," Prakash said. He said it carefully, the way people say things when they've heard a version of a story and want to know if it matches reality. "Part of it. I heard Holst's version." "I figured." Prakash ate a cracker. He was a good doctor, cautious, technically sharp, with the quality she'd noticed in a few people of being willing to look at evidence and update his conclusions based on it, which was rarer than it should have been. "The security report mentioned the unattended bag," he said. "It mentioned the dog flagged it." "Yeah." "It didn't mention you." She looked at the cracker she was holding. "That's pretty standard." He didn't say anything else about it, which was probably the most respectful thing he could have done. Sunday she ran 6 miles, which was what she did when she needed to clear something out. The trail behind her apartment complex went up into the foothills for about 3 miles before it turned back. And by the time she made the turn, she'd stopped thinking about Holst's face and started thinking about the problem itself, which was that Dax had recognized her in a way that couldn't be explained by her personnel file, and now people were going to start asking questions she'd spent 3 years not answering. She had not hidden in Silver Creek exactly. She had simply not offered information that nobody had asked for. Her nursing certification was genuine. Her 4 years of hospital floor experience was real. Everything in her personnel file was accurate. It was just that her personnel file contained approximately a fifth of her actual history, because the rest of it existed in records that were either classified or, and this was the part she tried not to think about too directly, missing. Not missing in a disorganized way. Missing in a deliberate way, which was a different thing entirely. She'd known, when she took the Silver Creek position, that she was close. The hospital sat on the edge of the base. Dax had been transferred here for his retirement assignment 18 months ago. She'd looked it up the week she signed her employment contract, more out of habit than anything else. She'd told herself it didn't matter, that she'd keep her head down and do her work, and nobody would ever connect a plainclothes nurse to a classified combat deployment that most of the people involved had strong reasons to forget. Then an old Belgian Malinois had walked across a ceremony ground and pressed his face into her hand like she was the only solid thing in a shifting world. She ran the last mile fast, which didn't help as much as she'd hoped. Holst's office was on the administrative floor, which was the only floor in the hospital that had been recently renovated, because that was the kind of budget prioritization that happened when the people making the decisions were also the people working in the renovated space. Lena arrived at 7:58. His assistant told her to wait, and she waited for 12 minutes, which she clocked not out of resentment, but because she timed most things by reflex. The office itself had a window overlooking the base's southern perimeter. She'd noticed it twice before, during previous administrative interactions, because the view from that window, on a clear day, showed the mountains in a way that was slightly different from ground level, cleaner, more exposed, the kind of landscape that looked simple from a distance and was considerably more complicated the moment you were actually in it. "Close the door," Holst said, without looking up from his desk. She closed it. Patrice Doyle was already seated in one of the side chairs. There was a third person Lena didn't recognize. A man in civilian clothes, late 40s, with the particular physical stillness of someone who spent a lot of time not being noticed. He wasn't introduced, and Lena noted that specifically. "Sit down," Holst said. She sat. "I'm going to be direct." He set down his pen, which was the gesture he used when he wanted to signal seriousness. Saturday's demonstration incident went into the base security log. Colonel Voss has been made aware. There are questions about how a nursing staff employee with no military training background was able to identify a working dog's alert signal ahead of the assigned handler. "I watched the dog," Lena said. "The signals weren't subtle." "You've said that. What I'm asking, what Colonel Voss is asking, what the base security officer is asking, is how you knew what you were watching." "I've worked with animals." "Where?" She looked at him steadily. "Various places." Holst's jaw tightened. "Ms. Whitmore, I have your personnel file in front of me, and I have your application materials, and I want to give you the opportunity to account for a gap that has come to my attention." "What gap?" "Between your nursing certification completion in 2018 and your previous employment records." He picked up a single sheet of paper. "You list a travel medicine contract position in 2018 and 2019, and then nothing until you joined Silver Creek in 2021. That's 2 years with no verifiable employment history." The unintroduced man in the side chair had not moved. His gaze had not moved off the middle distance, which was the specific kind of inattention that was actually the opposite of inattention. "I did independent contractor work," Lena said. "For?" "Various clients." "You're not being very forthcoming." "I'm answering what you're asking." Holst leaned back. "Here's the situation. You violated a perimeter restriction on Friday. You inserted yourself into a military security matter without authorization. You clearly have some kind of background that isn't reflected in your employment documentation, and that background is relevant to how you present yourself to this hospital and this institution." He paused. "I'm placing you on administrative leave pending a review of your employment records. Effective today." Lena kept her expression flat. "You can contest this through HR," Patrice said, with the tone of someone who believed the HR process would produce a specific outcome. "That's all," Holst said. Lena stood. She was at the door when the unintroduced man finally moved. Not much, just a slight rotation of his head, enough that she could see his face in profile. He was looking at her with the alert, calibrated attention of someone who already knew the answer to most of the questions being asked in this room and was deciding what to do about that. She met his eyes for half a second. He didn't look away. She left. The administrative leave badge swap happened in HR, which meant she had to hand over her access card and receive a temporary visitor's pass that wouldn't open any of the clinical doors. She did it without comment, signed 2 forms, and walked out of the building into the late morning light. She called no one. She went home, changed out of her scrubs, and made herself a pot of coffee, with the kind of focused deliberateness she used when she needed to keep her hands occupied. Her phone rang at 12:43. Unknown number. She let it ring 3 times before answering. "Whitmore," she said. A voice she didn't recognize, male, measured, about 40 words a minute faster than most people's conversational pace. "I was in Dr. Holst's office this morning. You noticed me." "I notice most things." "I know." A pause that felt precisely calibrated. "My name is Garrison. I work with the Defense Inspector General's office. We've been looking at a records discrepancy that intersects with Silver Creek Military Medical Center, and we became aware of your situation here approximately 6 days ago." Lena set her coffee mug down on the counter. "What kind of records discrepancy?" she asked. "The kind involving a classified overseas medical operation in 2019, he said. "The kind where someone with your specific qualifications was listed on the initial mission manifest and absent from every subsequent document, and the kind where certain senior personnel on that mission have since received commendations for outcomes they may not have earned." She was quiet for 4 seconds. "Why are you calling me?" "Because Friday's ceremony put a flag in our timeline," Garrison said. "And because Sergeant Major Dax's behavioral response to you on that field is now logged in a security report that 3 separate people have asked us to explain." Another pause. "We'd like to talk to you, Ms. Whitmore. Not on base. Not in a building where Dr. Holst or Colonel Voss has administrative authority." Outside her window, the mountains sat the way they always sat. Patient, enormous, indifferent to the small, complicated things happening at their base. "When?" she asked. "Tomorrow," Garrison said, "unless something changes in the next 12 hours. The way he said the last sentence, the careful neutrality of it, told her that something changing in the next 12 hours was not just a possibility. It was already in motion. She didn't sleep well, which wasn't unusual, but that night it was worse than normal. She lay on top of the covers with the window open and listened to the wind move through the foothills and thought about the word manifest. Initial mission manifest. Garrison had used it deliberately. He was that kind of speaker, every word load-bearing, nothing decorative. If her name was on the initial manifest and absent from every subsequent document, that meant someone had gone back in. Not once, in a careless oversight. Deliberately, with access, with intent. She knew whose access it would have been. She'd known for 3 years, in the way you know things you can't prove, carrying the knowledge the way you carry a stone in your shoe. Not crippling, just present, just constant, just wrong enough to alter every step. She got up at 4:30, made coffee, and waited for the sun. Garrison's call had specified a coffee shop in the town of Marlow, 12 miles from the base, at 10 in the morning. She drove out early, took a route that added 20 minutes, and spent the extra time watching the rearview mirror with the peripheral attentiveness that she'd tried, over 3 years of civilian life, to make less automatic. It had not become less automatic. The coffee shop was called Teller's, and it occupied a corner building that had previously been a hardware store. The bones of the shelving were still visible along the back wall, painted over but structurally intact, and the ceiling was high enough that conversations didn't carry the way they did in low-ceilinged spaces. Garrison had chosen well. He was already there. Same civilian clothes, same quality of stillness. He had coffee in front of him that he hadn't touched. She sat down across from him. "You're early," he said. "So are you." He turned the coffee cup a quarter rotation. "I need to tell you something before we start, because I think it'll change what you're willing to tell me." The base security report from Friday's ceremony was flagged by someone in Voss's administrative office within 4 hours of filing. The flag requested a personnel background pull on you, specifically. Lena looked at him. "How fast did it come back?" "The base pull came back clean because your Silver Creek file is clean, but it triggered an automated cross-reference in a separate system, a federal contractor database that retained your original service designation." He finally picked up his coffee. "By Saturday morning, 3 people knew your full name had surfaced in connection with Silver Creek." "Who were the 3? "Colonel Voss, his executive officer, a Major Denton Callis, and Dr. Warren Holst." She absorbed this. She thought about Holst's office on Monday morning, the unintroduced man in the side chair, which had been Garrison himself. The prepared list quality of Holst's accusations, the 12-minute wait. "He knew before the meeting," she said. "He knew before the meeting. And he still put me on administrative leave." Garrison set his cup down. "Miss Whitmore, I want to be direct with you. The Inspector General's office has been building a records case involving the 2019 Keldara forward operation for 14 months. What we have is a pattern: commendations filed for personnel who were not in primary positions during the critical events, medical action reports that don't match the field communications timeline, a classified mission outcome that was attributed to a team leader who, based on the raw satellite data and the radio logs we've recovered, was not the individual who made the key decisions in the field. She kept her eyes on the table for a moment. Then she looked up. "What do you need from me?" "Your account. On record." He leaned forward slightly. "And anything you kept." The word kept sat between them. "Why would I have kept anything?" she asked. "Because you're the kind of person who keeps things," he said simply, without judgment. "Because whatever happened out there was significant enough that you built a parallel life around staying near the dog who was there with you, and that's not something people do when they've let go." She didn't answer immediately. Outside the window, a truck went by on the main road, and a woman walked past with a stroller, and the ordinary world conducted itself with complete indifference to the conversation happening inside Teller's coffee shop. "There are some things I need to know first," she said. "What happens to the case if I give you a formal account?" "It strengthens the evidentiary foundation significantly. Right now we have circumstantial pattern, the timeline inconsistencies, the satellite data, 2 field medics who gave statements that contradict the official after-action report in specific ways. Your account would give us a named primary source. And if the named primary source ends up discredited, if Holster Voss pushes back hard enough to make my account look like a disgruntled employee filing a grievance?" Garrison was quiet for 2 seconds. "That's a real risk. I won't tell you otherwise." "Okay," she said. "Okay, you'll give us a statement?" "Okay. I needed to know you'd tell me the truth about the risk." She looked at him steadily. "Yes, I'll give you a statement." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small recording device, analog, not networked. He set it on the table without ceremony. "Whenever you're ready." She wrapped her hands around her own coffee cup and thought about where to begin, which was harder than it should have been, because every version of the beginning required her to go back to a place she'd spent 3 years constructing a careful distance from. "Keldara forward," she said. "February 2019. I was attached to the 3rd Special Forces Group as an 18D Special Forces Medical Sergeant, secondarily qualified in combat trauma and TCCC. My team leader was Major Roland Spears." She watched Garrison's expression do nothing, which was confirmation enough that the name Roland Spears was already in his files. "We were inserted ahead of a personnel recovery mission. There was a compromised asset in a village about 9 kilometers from the forward operating base. The mission parameters were straightforward until they weren't, which is how those missions usually go." She paused. "Spears made a call about approach vector that I disagreed with. On record, I stated my objection in the field communications, which means it should be in the radio logs you have." "It is," Garrison confirmed. "We took fire from a position that the approach vector left us exposed to. 3 personnel wounded, 1 critically. Dax was with us. He was working with Handler Sergeant First Class Milo Reyes at the time. Reyes took a through and through to the upper left arm, and a fragment hit to the side that punctured his lung partially. He was down." She stopped. "Dax went to the compromised assets position on his own initiative when the shooting started. He found a secondary shooter that the rest of the team hadn't located yet. He took a hit to the left ear and jaw. Rifle butt, not a round, before Spears could get to him." "And the outcome?" Garrison asked. "We recovered the asset. We stabilized Reyes in the field. I intubated him under fire, which is not something I'm proud of as a sentence because it sounds impressive. But it was terrifying, and it mostly worked because I got lucky with the angle." She said the last part flatly, without effect. "Dax needed surgical intervention that I performed on site before we could transport him. I worked on him for 40 minutes while the perimeter held, and then we extracted." A beat. "Everyone came home, including the dog." "And Spears' account?" "Filed the after-action report himself. I didn't see it until months later when a friend, someone I trusted, sent me a scan." She kept her voice even. "He'd attributed the approach modification to himself, the field decision that saved the asset recovery. He'd listed himself as the primary medical responder. Reyes was documented as self-ambulatory, which he was not. And my name appeared once under supporting personnel." Garrison said nothing, The recording device sat between them, its small red light steady. "I raised it through my chain of command," she said. "I was told the after-action report was finalized and that field accounts sometimes differ in recall. I raised it again. I was told I was demonstrating poor team cohesion. 2 months after the mission, my service contract was not renewed." She picked up her coffee and found it had gone cold, which seemed about right. "What happened after your contract ended?" Garrison asked. "I got a nursing certification. I worked contracts. I took the Silver Creek position because—" She stopped, rearranged the sentence. "Because Dax was there, and because I'd heard Spears had a connection to the base administration, and I wanted to know what I was dealing with." "Spears is currently a full colonel," Garrison said. "He commands the 3rd Group's Medical Oversight Division. He's been recommended for a senior advisory position at the Surgeon General's office." The silence in this coffee shop was the kind with mass. "The commendation he received in 2019, Garrison continued, was for the Keldara forward operation. It's the centerpiece of his record. Everything that came after, the promotions, the advisory positions, the reputation, builds on that." Lena looked out the window. "So if the Keldara account unravels," she said. "Everything built on it is also a problem," Garrison said. "Yes." She nodded once and didn't say anything else for a moment. "What happens next?" she asked. "We need the materials, anything you retained from the period, communications, personal logs, photographs, anything with a timestamp that contradicts the official record. I'll need a day." "You have it." He reached across and stopped the recorder. "One more thing. The administrative leave Holst placed you on, don't fight it through HR. Don't contest it, don't respond to it formally, don't do anything that puts your name in the base administrative system in the next 72 hours. Can you do that?" "Why 72 hours?" He picked up his coffee cup, realized it was also cold, and set it back down. "Because in 72 hours, some things are going to change." She drove back to Silver Creek and parked 2 blocks from her apartment and sat in the car for a few minutes doing nothing, which was its own kind of processing. The thing about having carried a wrong thing for 3 years is that when someone finally confirms you were right, it doesn't feel like relief. It feels like the wrong thing getting heavier, because now it has weight and shape, and it's real in a way it couldn't quite be when it was just something you knew alone in a room. She went inside. She made more coffee. She went to the hall closet, pushed past the winter coat and 2 boxes of books she'd never unpacked, and found the lockbox on the shelf at the back. She had not opened it since Silver Creek. It contained a waterproof envelope with a USB drive, a small notebook with a cracked cover, and 7 photographs printed on matte paper. Not digital. She'd printed them specifically, at a copy shop 2 states away, because digital files could be located and deleted, and she'd had reason by then to think about such things. She sat on the floor of the hallway with the box in her lap and looked at the photographs one at a time. Most of them were time-stamped by the camera's internal clock, and the timestamps contradicted Roland Spears' after-action report in ways that weren't subtle. The photo of Reyes on the extraction stretcher tagged 1432 established that he was non-ambulatory at a time the report described him as self-extracting. The photo of Dax's wound taken before her surgical intervention established the injury severity. The photo of the approach path taken by her own hand at 11:07 established the position they'd been in before the engagement, the position she'd flagged in the radio log, the position she'd argued against. The notebook was her field log. She kept one on every deployment, in defiance of no specific regulation, but certainly not officially encouraged. Handwritten, dated. Her handwriting, which was bad in the cramped, hurried way of someone who'd spent years writing notes under conditions that discouraged legibility. She put everything back in the waterproof envelope and set it on the kitchen counter where she would not forget it. Then she sat at the kitchen table and thought about Garrison's 72 hours. She found out what changed in the 72 hours not from Garrison, but from Prakash, who texted her at 7 in the morning on Wednesday with a message that said only, "Come to the south entrance, don't use your visitor pass." She went. He was waiting by the fire door, which was technically always unlocked from the inside for emergency egress, which meant it was also accessible from the outside if you were standing with a doctor who propped it open. "What's happening?" she asked. "Something came in last night," he said. He looked like he'd been awake for a while. "A transfer request from the base command. Military Medical Oversight is sending a team to conduct an audit of the hospital's clinical records and staffing protocols." He glanced at her. It's not the kind of audit Holst runs. It's the kind where people from outside come in and look at everything. When did the request come through? Last night. Holst called a senior staff meeting at 6 this morning. I was in it because I'm covering trauma this week. He rubbed the back of his neck. He mentioned your administrative leave specifically. He said it was precautionary and that the timing relative to the audit was coincidental. What did you think about that? I thought it wasn't coincidental. He looked at her directly. Lena, what's actually happening? She considered how much to say. There's an investigation, she told him. It involves the base command. I'm a witness in it, not a subject. He was quiet for a moment. The audit? Is that part of the investigation? Probably adjacent to it. Is there anything... He stopped, started again. Is there anything I should know, clinically, about what's been happening here? She thought about that. The K9 demonstration incident, Holst's characterization of it in the security log. What about it? If anyone asks you what you know about my background and whether it matches my personnel file, tell them exactly what you observed, not what you assumed, not what you were told, what you saw. Prakash nodded slowly. It was the nod of someone connecting points he'd had separately. Okay, he said. She went back out the fire door into the morning air, which was cold and smelled like the mountains, and her phone rang before she'd taken 20 steps. Unknown number, but a different unknown. Different prefix from Garrison's. She answered. Ms. Whitmore. A woman's voice, clipped, precise, the specific efficiency of military command. My name is Colonel Adrienne Marek. I'm the lead officer on the medical oversight audit team arriving at Silver Creek today. I was briefed on your situation this morning by the Inspector General's office. Lena stopped walking. Colonel Marek, I want to be clear about something before we meet formally. The audit authority. I'm operating under supersedes base command administrative decisions, including personnel actions like your current leave status. You will be permitted on base and in the hospital facility during the audit period. Dr. Holst has been informed of this. A beat. How did he take that? Lena asked. A pause that might have contained something wry. He expressed his concerns through appropriate channels, Mark said. I've noted them. When do you want to meet? This afternoon, 2 o'clock. I'll be in the hospital's conference room B. Your badge will work by noon. Another pause, shorter. I've reviewed the preliminary file, Ms. Whitmore. What happened to your service record is a serious matter, and I want you to know that this office takes it that way. Lena stood on the sidewalk outside Silver Creek Military Medical Center, with the mountains behind it and the cold air moving steadily, and let herself feel, for exactly 3 seconds, what it was like to have someone in a position of authority say that to her. 3 seconds was enough. 2 o'clock, she said. I'll be there. She used the morning to make copies, not the originals, which she kept in the waterproof envelope, but high-resolution scans that she burned to 2 separate drives and put in 2 separate locations. She was thorough about it. She'd watched someone lose everything they had because there was only 1 copy, and she'd decided then that she was a 2-copy person at minimum. At 11:57, she walked up to the hospital's main entrance, held her badge to the scanner, and the door opened. The security officer at the desk, a young specialist she recognized from the ceremony, watched her come through and said nothing, which was either professional discretion or the specific blankness of someone who'd been told this morning that something had changed and was still absorbing it. She went to her locker on the nursing floor. Her scrubs were where she'd left them. She changed because the visit badge had felt wrong, and the scrubs felt like herself, or the version of herself she'd built here that was smaller than the whole but was still real. Patrice Doyle was at the nursing station when she came out. The expression on Patrice's face cycled through 3 things fast: surprise, recalculation, and something that wanted to be authority but couldn't quite find its footing. You shouldn't be, Patrice started. Colonel Marek's office reinstated my access this morning, Lena said. There's documentation in the administrative system if you need to check. Patrice looked at the computer terminal. Back at Lena. Dr. Holst is going to... I know, Lena said. He's welcome to raise it with Colonel Marek. She went to the supply station and started her pre-shift checkout of habit, because habits were what kept you functional when everything around you was in the process of rearranging itself. She heard Patrice make a phone call. She didn't listen to it. At 1:45, she took the elevator to the 3rd floor where the conference rooms were, and she walked down the hallway past Holst's office, whose door was closed, with voices audible through it. Multiple voices, not comfortable ones. Conference room B had a round table and fluorescent lighting that someone had partially addressed with two standing lamps in the corners, which improved things only marginally. Colonel Marek was already there, along with two other people in uniform she didn't recognize, and Garrison, who nodded at her when she came in without making it a production. Marek stood. She was taller than Lena had expected. Late 50s, a measured physical stillness, with the kind of face that had absorbed a significant number of things over the years, and had processed them into something functional. "Ms. Whitmore," she said, "sit down. We have a lot to cover, and I want to give you time to be thorough." Lena sat. Garrison put a glass of water in front of her. "We're going to start," Marek said, "with Keldara forward. I need the full account in your own words, on record. After that, we'll move to the materials you've retained. And then," she paused, and something in her expression shifted slightly, not soft exactly, but honest. "Then we need to talk about what happened to Colonel Spear's file in the 2 weeks following the mission." "What about it?" Lena asked. "We've identified the specific point at which your name was removed from the primary personnel record," Garrison said. "The file modification log, which was supposed to be purged but wasn't, because the person who did it apparently wasn't aware of the backup system, shows an access event from a secure terminal registered to Major Denton Callis. She had not known it was Callis. She'd known it was someone with access. She'd suspected Spears, which was the obvious guess. Callis was Voss's executive officer. The officer she'd seen standing beside Voss on the ceremony stage, a compact man with a flat expression who'd been at Silver Creek for 8 years. "Callis," she said. "Callis," Garrison confirmed. "And based on what we've recovered from the file log, he wasn't doing it independently. There are communications, encrypted, but not encrypted well enough, between him and Spears going back to March 2019, 1 month after Keldara forward." The conference room was very quiet. "How bad is it?" Lena asked. "For Spears," Marek said, "it's career-ending at minimum, the falsification of a classified after-action report, the suppression of a medical personnel record, the improper attribution of a commendation." She paused. "And depending on what your testimony and materials establish about the field decisions at Keldara forward, potentially worse." "There were 3 people wounded because of his approach call," Lena said. "Reyes almost died." "I know." Marek looked at her steadily. "I've read the satellite data and the radio logs. I know what the record shows, and I know what the after-action report shows. Your account is the last piece we needed to confirm that the gap between them isn't a clerical error." Outside the conference room window, Lena could see the base perimeter, and beyond it the flat Colorado plain running toward the mountains, and the sky above it in the particular blue of high altitude in October, the kind of blue that meant the air was clear for 50 miles. "Then let me give you the account," she said. She put the waterproof envelope on the table and opened it. She took out the notebook first, then the photographs, then the USB drive. She laid them out in order, by date, the way she'd always organized field materials, chronological, cross-referenced, nothing out of place. Marek looked at the photographs. She looked at them carefully, each one, without rushing. When she got to the one of Reyes on the stretcher, timestamp 1432, Reyes prone, Lena's hand visible at the edge of the frame where she'd been managing his airway, Marek's expression shifted in a way that wasn't about the investigation. "You did this," Marek said, "under fire." "We were in cover by then," Lena said. "Mostly." Marek nodded once and set the photograph down. "Okay," she said, "let's start from the beginning." The door to conference room B was closed and the audit team was assembled and the recording was running, and Lena took a breath and went back to February 2019, to a cold night on a forward operating base, to the moment before everything went sideways, and then past that moment into the thing itself, which she had never told in full, in order, on record, to anyone. It took 2.5 hours. When she finished, the room was quiet in the specific way that rooms get quiet when something that has been wrong for a long time has just been named accurately. Garrison closed his notebook. Marek looked at the materials on the table, the photographs, the field log, the drive, and then she looked at Lena. "This is sufficient," she said. "More than sufficient." Lena nodded. She was tired in a bone-deep way that wasn't about the afternoon's length. "What happens now?" she asked. Marek opened her mouth to answer. The door opened. The specialist who'd been at the desk downstairs, the young one from the ceremony, stood in the doorway with an expression that meant something had changed downstairs in the last 5 minutes. "Colonel Marek," he said, "there's a situation on the base perimeter. Security's requesting medical personnel." "What kind of situation?" Marek said. "Training accident, ma'am. 2 injured, and—" He hesitated. "The K9 team was involved. Sergeant Briggs is one of the injured." The room moved fast after that. Marek was on her radio. Garrison was on his phone. The 2 uniformed officers were up and out. Lena was already at the door. "Ms. Whitmore," Garrison started. "Briggs is hurt and Dax is out there," she said, and her voice had a different quality than it had held for the past 2.5 hours. Older, maybe. More certain. She didn't wait for his response. She went through the conference room door and down the hall and hit the stairwell at a pace that was not quite running, and behind her she heard Garrison say something she couldn't make out, and ahead of her through the stairwell window she could see the base perimeter lights flickering on in the early dusk, and somewhere out there a dog she'd operated on in a dark room in a country she wasn't supposed to name was in a situation, and she was the person who understood him best, and the distance between her and that situation was closing fast. At the bottom of the stairs she pushed through the emergency exit into the cold air, and stopped. Roland Spears was standing on the walkway between the hospital and the base gate, in full uniform, with 2 military police officers flanking him. But they weren't flanking him the way an escort flanks a superior officer. They were flanking him the way an escort flanks someone who is not going to be walking away freely. He looked at her. She looked at him. He was older than the last time she'd seen him, which had been across a briefing room in 2019 when she'd been told her contract was not being renewed. His face had the tight, controlled quality of someone who had decided, sometime in the last hour, that the best approach was to project calm authority, and was discovering that calm authority was considerably harder to project when you were standing between 2 MPs at the entrance to a base where your file was currently being audited. "Lena," he said, like they were colleagues who'd run into each other. She didn't answer. "I want you to know," he started. "Sir?" One of the MPs, not unkindly but very firmly, "We need to keep moving." They moved. She watched him walk toward the gate, and she noticed that his pace was careful and deliberate, not the walk of a man going somewhere he'd chosen. Her phone buzzed. "Garrison. Perimeter situation is real. Briggs is injured. Dax is unaccounted for. Get to the East Access Road." She ran. The East Access Road ran along the interior edge of the base perimeter fence, a service lane wide enough for 2 vehicles that was used mostly by maintenance crews and K9 training patrols. Lena had been on it twice, once during an orientation walk her first week at Silver Creek, once when she'd cut through it on a long lunch break because the main path was blocked by a construction vehicle. She knew the layout enough to move fast. The light was going. October in Colorado meant dusk hit at 5:30 and hit hard, the temperature dropping 10 degrees in 20 minutes and the sky going from blue to a bruised orange-gray that turned the perimeter fence into a series of dark verticals against a dimming field. She could see the security lights at the east gate flickering to life as she came around the corner of the motor pool building, and she could see the shape of a vehicle, a base security truck, lights on, stopped about 200 meters down the access road. She ran toward it. A security sergeant she didn't know put his hand up as she approached. "Ma'am, this is a restricted—" "Garrison sent me." She had her hospital badge out. "Where's Briggs?" The sergeant looked at the badge, looked at her face, made a decision based on something she couldn't entirely read. "Behind the truck. Dog's still out past the fence breach. We can't get near him." She went around the truck. Briggs was on the ground, sitting up against the rear wheel with his left leg extended at an angle that said the knee was wrong. A base medic, young, E4, the kit open in front of him, had an ice pack against the joint and was doing his evaluation with the careful attention of someone who knew what he was looking at but wasn't sure how bad it was. Briggs's face was pale and sheened with the particular sweat of acute pain. "Hey," Lena said, dropping to a crouch beside him. He looked at her with the slightly unfocused quality of someone whose nervous system was occupied with managing something significant. "The dog," he said. "He went through the fence." "I know. I'll get to him. What happened?" "Training run. We were working the east perimeter lane, standard pattern. Dax flagged something in the brush on the outside of the fence, and He stopped, his jaw tightening as a wave of something hit him. "I tried to redirect him, and he went hard left, and the leash caught me wrong. I went down, knee twisted, and he went through the gap before I could... He stopped again. The gap's been there since last week. Maintenance ticket's been open. Nobody fixed it. Where's the gap? 30 meters past the second light post. He went through at full speed, northeast direction. He was tracking something. She looked at the medic. What's your assessment? The medic looked up. He was young enough that he probably wasn't used to being asked for assessments by people who weren't in his chain of command, but he answered anyway. Possible lateral ligament damage, maybe meniscus. Nothing displaced. He's stable, pain managed. Good. Keep the ice on and don't let him put weight on it. She stood. Can you get him transport to the hospital? Working on it, the sergeant behind her said. She went northeast along the fence line at a pace that was faster than a walk and not quite a run. The ground was uneven here. Maintenance vehicles had rutted the access lane, and the grass on either side was tufted and irregular, and the light was bad enough that she was navigating partly by the fence posts. She passed the second light post and saw the gap, a section of chain link that had been pushed outward from the base interior. The lower 2 feet bent away from the frame at an angle that left enough space for a dog at speed to push through without breaking stride. She stopped at the gap and looked through it. Beyond the fence, a field of dry autumn grass running toward a drainage ditch about 60 meters out, and beyond the ditch, a line of scrubby brush and small trees that marked the edge of the base's undeveloped eastern boundary. The light was low enough now that the brush line was mostly shadow. She listened. Nothing for 3 seconds. Then, rustling, directional, from the brush line, specific. Dax, she said, not loud, not the command voice, just the register he knew. The rustling stopped. Dax, higher. The Czech command for come here, the one he'd been trained on. A pause that lasted long enough that she began to calculate alternatives. Then movement in the brush, low and quick. And Dax came out of the shadow line at a fast trot with his nose down and his body at the particular angle that meant he was still tracking, but had been interrupted by something more important. Her voice, her scent, whatever combination of sense memory had fired when he heard the word in the right language from the right person. He came through the gap without slowing and hit her legs at the knee with his full weight, which was solid enough that she had to widen her stance to absorb it. She put her hands on him. Did it fast and systematic, muzzle, throat, chest, flanks, legs, looking for blood, for irregularity, for the held-away posture that meant something hurt. His breathing was elevated but even. No blood. The old scar on his ear was intact. He was physically fine, but his body was still oriented northeast, toward the brush, even while he was pressed against her. What did you find? She said to herself more than to him. She straightened up, pulled out her phone, and turned the flashlight on. She shone it through the gap toward the drainage ditch and the brush beyond it. The light caught something at the edge of the ditch. She went through the gap. She was aware, as she did it, that she was leaving the base perimeter without authorization, without a security escort, without telling the sergeant behind her what she was doing. She was also aware that Dax was already back through the gap and moving toward the ditch at a purposeful trot, and that whatever he'd flagged out there was real. She reached the ditch edge and angled the light down. A man. Civilian clothes, lying partially submerged in 6 inches of standing water at the ditch bottom, face up, unconscious. Mid-50s, heavy-set, wearing what had been a contractor uniform shirt, the kind the base maintenance crews wore. No visible equipment, no weapon. She was down the ditch bank in 3 steps, into the cold water up to her ankles, and she had 2 fingers at his carotid before she'd fully assessed anything else. Pulse. Weak, irregular, but there. Sir, she gripped his shoulder. Sir, can you hear me? Nothing. She ran her hands over him quickly. The field assessment her hands knew how to do without her brain having to direct them. No obvious fractures. A contusion on the right temple, significant swelling. Breathing was present but shallow, about 10 breaths per minute, which was low. Pupils, she checked with the phone light, unequal, left wider than right. She had a decision to make in about 4 seconds. And the decision was, this man had a head injury with signs of increasing intracranial pressure, and she was standing in a ditch outside the base perimeter, with no equipment, no airway adjuncts, no IV access, and no backup. She looked up the ditch bank. Dax was at the top, watching her. Go, she said. The Czech command for return to handler. It was also, in a pinch, the command Milo Reyes had taught him to associate with get someone. Dax went. She heard him go through the gap at speed, and she heard, distantly, the sergeant's voice saying something sharp, and she knew she had maybe 5 minutes before either help arrived, or she had to find another way to get this man out of a ditch before his brain herniated. She moved him carefully. Log roll, minimal cervical movement, the way you did it when you didn't have a collar and didn't have a board and had to do it anyway. Got him partially up the bank, out of the water, onto the sloped grass at the ditch edge, where his airway was at least at a better angle. His breathing didn't improve substantially, but it didn't deteriorate either. She heard boots on the ground. 2 security personnel came through the gap, following Dax, who had apparently done exactly what she'd sent him to do. The sergeant was behind them, and behind the sergeant was a figure she didn't expect, Garrison, moving fast for a man in civilian shoes on uneven ground. "Down here," she called. They came down the bank. The medic from Briggs' position was with them. Someone had thought to bring him, which was the first operationally sound decision she'd seen from the base security team in the last 15 minutes. "Head trauma," she said as the medic reached her. "GCS I'd put at 6 or 7. Pupils unequal, left dilated, breathing's depressed. He needs imaging, and he needs it inside 30 minutes. "What happened to him?" the sergeant asked. "I don't know. Dax found him." She stepped back to give the medic room. "Do you have a board?" "In the truck," one of the security personnel said, already turning back toward the gap. "Go." Things move faster after that, in the way things move when the right people are doing the right things in sequence. Board retrieved, stabilized, carried up the bank, and through the gap, loaded. Lena rode in the back of the security truck with the man's head between her hands the entire way to the hospital entrance, maintaining his airway by position, because she had no adjuncts, and that was what she had. She got him to the trauma bay. She gave the handoff to the ER physician, a doctor named Solace, who was fast and competent and took the assessment without argument or qualification, and then she stepped back out of the bay and stood in the corridor for a moment with her hands hanging at her sides. Her shoes were wet, her hands were cold. She had a standing water line on the lower legs of her scrubs from the ditch. Garrison appeared at the end of the corridor, moving at a pace that suggested he'd been looking for her. "Who is he?" she asked, before Garrison could speak. "His name is Ferris Okafor. He's a maintenance supervisor, been with the base contractor pool for 6 years. Garrison stopped beside her. He looked at the trauma bay doors. "He filed a complaint this morning." She looked at him. "About what?" "About being directed to delay a maintenance repair on the east perimeter fence, specifically the gap in the chain link on the access road." He paused. "The work order was submitted 10 days ago. The direction to delay came through a facilities management channel that traces back to Major Callis's office." Lena was very still for a moment. "Callis," she said. "The gap was logged in the system. The K9 training route runs that lane twice a week. If a dog went through the gap during a training run..." Garrison stopped. "It would look like an accident," Lena said. "A handler injury, a loose dog, an incident report. An incident that might, in the context of everything else happening this week, create enough administrative disruption to slow the audit or discredit the person who'd been seen to have unusual influence over the dog." She looked at him steadily. "They used the fence." "We think so. Okafor apparently put that together himself this afternoon when he heard about Briggs' injury. He went out to the east access road to document the gap, and someone, we don't know who yet, met him there. He was assaulted," she said. "The bruising on his temple is inconsistent with a fall. The ME team will confirm, but..." Garrison nodded. "Yes." The trauma bay doors swung open and Dr. Solis came out, already pulling his gloves off. He looked at Lena. "He's stable. We're taking him to CT now. Your assessment was right on the ICP signs. He needs intervention, but we caught it. Another hour in that ditch." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "Thank you," Lena said. Solis went. Garrison watched him go. "How many people know about the fence delay order?" she asked. "Right now, me, you, and Colonel Marek." He glanced at her. "And whoever gave the order." "Is Callis still on base?" Garrison's expression shifted in a way that wasn't quite an answer, but was close enough to one. Colonel Marek placed a hold on non-essential personnel departures from the base at 1700. Nobody leaves without clearance. Lena looked at her wet shoes. She looked at the trauma bay doors. She thought about a maintenance supervisor who'd figured out what he was standing in the middle of and had gone to document it alone, which was brave and also very nearly fatal. Okafor's complaint this morning, she said. Was it filed through base channels? Internal Facilities Management System, which Callis has access to. Yes. She thought about that for 2 seconds. So Callis knew the complaint existed before Okafor was hurt. The corridor was quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped in the rhythmic, patient way monitors beeped. The fluorescent light above the trauma bay entrance had a flicker at the edge of its cycle that nobody had fixed. Colonel Marek needs to know this tonight, Lena said. She already does. She's been briefed in the last 10 minutes. Garrison looked at her directly. She also wants to talk to you again. About Okafor? About something we found when we pulled Callis's communication records this afternoon. He stopped. Lena, Spears wasn't just in contact with Callis about the record modification in 2019. He's been in contact with him recently, in the last 6 weeks. She absorbed this. Since I took the job at Silver Creek, she said. Since 2 weeks before you took the job at Silver Creek, someone flagged your nursing certification application when it cross-referenced the contractor database. Spears was notified. Garrison held her gaze. He's known you were here for almost 3 years. The thing about receiving information that rearranges the shape of something you thought you understood is that it doesn't feel like surprise. It feels like confirmation of something your nervous system already knew, but your conscious mind had been organizing away from. 3 years. She'd thought she was watching him. He'd been watching her. Why didn't he move sooner? She asked. We think he calculated that as long as you weren't acting, as long as you were just a nurse in a hospital, the risk of moving against you was higher than the risk of leaving you alone. The ceremony changed that. When Dax broke formation, it went into a security log. The moment it was logged, there was a paper trail connecting you to the dog and the dog to the mission. And a paper trail is something that can be followed in both directions, she said. Yes. She understood then the sequence of it. The personnel background pull within 4 hours of the ceremony. The Monday meeting with Holst, who'd known going in. The administrative leave, which had been intended not as a personnel action but as a containment measure. The fence gap left unrepaired, the training route known, the accident that was supposed to happen to a handler and a dog on a route that ran 200 meters from the base perimeter. It had been moving since Friday. All of it, since the moment Dax had crossed a ceremony ground and pressed his nose into her palm. I need to see Marek, she said. She's in conference room B. She started moving. Lena, Garrison's voice behind her. She stopped. Spears made a call from the MP's vehicle 30 minutes ago. They allowed it. He's not formally charged yet, just held pending the audit findings. He called his attorney. A pause. His attorney is Marcus Holland. She turned around slowly. Marcus Holland was the kind of name you knew if you'd spent time in military legal circles, a former JAG officer turned civilian defense attorney with a specific specialty in high-profile military misconduct cases and a specific reputation for making evidence problems for opposing counsel. He was expensive, he was effective, and he had a documented pattern of filing preemptive motions that created procedural delays long enough for institutional memory to fade. How long does Holland take to arrive? She asked. He's in Denver, 3 hours by road, less by air. Garrison looked at her. The audit findings need to be formally documented before he can file anything. Marek knows that. She's moving as fast as she can move within procedure. Which means tonight matters. Tonight matters a lot. She went. Conference room B was different from 2 hours ago. The round table now had 4 additional people around it, 2 in JAG uniforms, 1 civilian with a laptop who was clearly the records specialist, and Colonel Marek at the head with a controlled urgency that manifested as compressed efficiency rather than visible stress. The materials Lena had laid out earlier were still on the table, now supplemented by printed documents and a laptop display showing what appeared to be a file modification log with specific timestamps highlighted. Marek looked up when Lena entered. You're wet. Drainage ditch, Lena said. Okafor's in the CT suite. Solis says he'll live. Good. Marek gestured at the chair across from her. Sit. We have a timeline problem. Lena sat. Holland will file a motion to delay audit findings pending independent counsel review of evidence collection procedures, standard playbook, and it has a success rate I find professionally irritating. Marek tapped the table once. We need the evidentiary record sealed tonight before he can file anything. That means every supporting document authenticated, every statement formally recorded, and every chain of custody detail airtight. What do you need from me? We need your materials authenticated and your statement formally transcribed and signed. Marek looked at the records specialist. Henderson, how long? If we start now, 2 hours. Maybe 2.5. We start now. Marek looked at Lena. I also need to tell you something that will affect your testimony, and I need your reaction to be on record. Major Callis was located in his vehicle in the base parking structure at 1740. He was attempting to access his personal laptop, which we believe contained the communication records with Spears. The MPs secured him and the device. Did he get into the laptop? Lena asked. He got in but didn't complete what he was trying to do. IT forensics is pulling the device now. Marek paused. He made a statement when he was detained. What did he say? He said Spears directed him to modify the Keldara records and promised him advancement as a result. He said he was given to understand that you, specifically you, had agreed to stay quiet in exchange for the contracting non-renewal rather than a formal separation with cause. Lena looked at the table for a moment. That's not true, she said. We know that. It's consistent with the pattern of what Spears does. He builds a version of events, and he tells it to enough people that it becomes ambient. Everyone around him hears it until it feels like established fact. Marek's voice was flat and factual. Callis believed it. Holst almost certainly believed it, which is how a man can make a personnel decision based on what he thinks he knows about someone and feel entirely justified doing it. Does Callis's statement help us or hurt us? It's a partial corroboration of the coercion element. It helps establish that Spears was the architect and Callis was a participant who acted under direction. One of the JAG officers started to say something. Marek raised one finger and he stopped. It's not a full exoneration of Callis. He made choices, but it shifts the primary culpability clearly. The JAG officer who hadn't spoken yet, a captain with a careful face, put a document on the table in front of Lena. There's something else you need to see. She looked at it. It was a commendation certificate. The Keldara Forward Commendation, Roland Spears' name in block letters at the top. She'd seen a version of it before. The friend who'd sent her the after-action report scan had included it, but this version had a handwritten annotation in the margin. Old ink, faded. Her name and a date and the word primary with a circle around it and what appeared to be an initialed signature beside it. That annotation was on the original physical document, the captain said, filed in a records archive that Spears apparently didn't know existed, a backup copy of the ceremony file from the 2019 commendation event held at a different facility. The archivist found it when we issued a records request this afternoon. Lena looked at her name, written in someone else's handwriting on a document that had been trying to erase her for 6 years. Whose initials? She said. General Warren Tesh, Marek said, who was the approving authority on the Keldara commendation and who is now retired but available and willing to be deposed. General Tesh had been at the ceremony in 2019. She'd been in the back of the room because she hadn't been invited to the front. She'd watched Spears accept the commendation with a handshake and a photograph, and she'd thought about leaving before the reception but had stayed because she couldn't remember why she'd stayed. Maybe she'd hoped someone would say something. Nobody had. But someone had written her name in a margin with the word primary and a circle around it, and initialed it, and a file had gone to an archive instead of to the shredder. I'd like to begin the formal statement, she said. Her voice was steady. Henderson, Marek said. The recording started. Lena talked for 1 hour and 40 minutes. She talked through Keldara Forward again, more formally this time, with dates and times and coordinates she'd carried in memory for 6 years, because the detail of things was one of the few forms of documentation she'd always had unrestricted access to. She talked about the after-action report she'd never filed because she hadn't been asked to file one, because Spears had filed for the whole team. She talked about the non-renewal. She talked about what she'd kept and why, and the record specialist authenticated each item as she produced it, assigning evidence numbers in sequence. At 10:47, she signed her name at the bottom of the transcription. At 10:49, Garrison appeared in the doorway. He looked at Marek. Holland filed electronically 20 minutes ago, he said. Motion to delay. Marek looked at the records specialist. Henderson. Are we sealed? Henderson checked the screen, checked again. Yes, ma'am. Sealed and filed at 22:43. Garrison looked at Lena. 4 minutes, he said. He filed 4 minutes after we sealed. The room held that for a moment. So the motion is, Lena started. Procedurally moot, the JAG captain said, and he said it with the restrained satisfaction of a man who had very much wanted to say exactly that. The evidentiary record is sealed and complete. The motion has nothing to delay. Marek closed the folder in front of her. She looked at Lena with the expression of someone who had been doing this long enough to understand that the small margins, the 4 minutes, the archived copy, the initials in a margin, were where everything either held or failed. You should go home, she said. You've been awake since before 6. You went into a drainage ditch. You need sleep. What happens tomorrow? Lena asked. Tomorrow, formal proceedings against Colonel Spears and Major Callis begin. Dr. Holst will be separately reviewed for the administrative leave action and for his handling of Friday's incident, which I believe will be found to have been influenced by information Callis fed him through back channels. Marek paused. Your employment status at this hospital will be addressed as part of the administrative review. I'll have a formal recommendation to the hospital director's office by morning. Holst is still the director. For tonight, Marek said, and did not expand on that. Lena stood. She picked up the waterproof envelope, empty now, everything logged, everything assigned its evidence number, and folded it and put it in her pocket out of habit. She was at the door when Marek spoke again. Ms. Whitmore. She turned. Marek was looking at her with an expression that had something in it that wasn't official and wasn't procedural. The annotation on the commendation document, she said. General Tesch's initials. I spoke with him this afternoon before he agreed to the deposition. And? He said he knew at the ceremony that something was wrong. He said Spears' account of the mission didn't match the satellite data he'd reviewed informally, and that there was a name absent from the team listing that he believed should have been present. Marek's voice was even, but the evenness was effortful in a way it hadn't been during the technical discussions. He said he annotated the document as a record for himself. He didn't act on it because he didn't have what he needed to act, and then the moment passed, and he's carried it since. Lena didn't say anything. He wanted me to tell you that, Marek said. I don't know if it helps. She thought about a general in a ceremony room writing her name in a margin and then going home and carrying it for 6 years. She thought about Dax pressing his face into her palm at the edge of a stage, certain in the way animals are certain, without procedure or documentation or the weight of institutional approval. Tell him it helps, she said. She went out. The hallway was quiet. The hospital at 11 o'clock was a different place than the hospital at 2. Lower light, fewer people. The nighttime rhythm of a clinical floor that was never fully asleep but breathed at a slower rate. She walked past the nursing station where she'd stood with Patrice Doyle that morning, a lifetime ago in the math of this particular day. At the end of the hall, the window showed the base perimeter lights. Steady now, the east access road dark and ordinary, no trucks, no movement. Somewhere in this building, Ferris Okafor was in a recovery bed following surgical intervention for a head injury that someone had given him to keep him quiet about a fence that someone had left broken to hurt a dog. Somewhere on this base, Roland Spears was in a holding room with his lawyer's motion already filed and already meaningless. Somewhere in the motor pool area, Dax was in the K9 facility, probably asleep, tracking whatever dogs tracked in their sleep. Scent trails and search patterns, and the memory of cold ditch water and a voice that spoke to him in the right language. She pressed the elevator call button. The doors opened. Inside, mirrored in the dull metal of the elevator back panel, she saw herself. Wet shoes, scrubs wrinkled from a day that had lasted about 16 hours, hair coming out of the tie she'd put it in that morning. She looked tired. She also looked, and she noticed this with the same detached accuracy she applied to most things, like someone who had stopped running in place. The elevator doors closed. Her phone buzzed. Prakash. CT results on Okafor came back. Subdural, small. Surgery team addressed it. He's going to be okay. She exhaled. Then before she could put the phone away, a second message arrived. Different number, one she'd seen before but hadn't expected tonight. It was from Garrison, and it contained 4 words and a timestamp. Callis is talking. Now. She stood in the elevator as it descended, reading those 3 words, and felt the specific sensation of something that had been wound very tight for a very long time, beginning, at last, to move. The elevator reached the ground floor. The doors opened. Standing in the lobby, in full uniform with no escort and no appointment, was a man she had never met but recognized immediately from his photograph in a military record she'd looked up exactly once 3 years ago when she was deciding whether to take the Silver Creek position. General Warren Tesh. He was 70, and he looked at her the way someone looks when they've been waiting to look at someone for a long time and are finally, at great cost to themselves, doing it. "Ms. Whitmore," he said. His voice was rough at the edges in the way of old men who'd spent decades outdoors. "I drove from Denver," he said. "I wasn't willing to do this by phone." He looked at her directly, and his eyes were the specific kind of tired that didn't come from the hour. "I owe you something that I can't give back, but I'd like to try to begin." The lobby was empty except for the night security officer at the desk, who was very deliberately not looking at them. Lena held the elevator door open for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she let it close. "There's a conference room upstairs," she said. "It's been a long day. We should sit down." The conference room they used was not Conference Room B. That room had spent the day accumulating the weight of everything that had been said in it, and Lena chose a different one, smaller, on the second floor, with a window that faced west instead of toward the perimeter. She turned on one of the standing lamps rather than the overhead fluorescents, because it was nearly midnight and the overhead lights had a quality that made everything feel like an interrogation. And what was about to happen was not that. General Tesh sat down heavily. He was a large man going soft at the edges in the way of men who had been physical their whole lives and were now past the point where the body kept up with the habit. His uniform was correct in every detail. She doubted he owned clothes that weren't. But his face had the particular looseness of someone who had driven 3 hours in the dark with a decision already made and now had to execute it. She sat across from him and waited. "I'm not going to dress it up," he said. "I'd rather you didn't." He put his hands on the table. Large hands. The knuckles enlarged the way they got from cold in years. "I reviewed the Keldara after-action report 10 days after it was filed. February 2019. I was the senior approving authority for third group commendations at that time." He looked at the table. The report had Spears as primary on the asset recovery decision and the medical response. It was clean on the surface, the kind of clean that takes work to produce. "What made you look closer?" The satellite data didn't match the timeline he filed. The approach vector, he claimed, the one that worked, wasn't the one the satellite had them on during the engagement window. There was a 12-minute gap between the last satellite position and the position he described making the critical call from. He paused. "I've been doing this long enough to know that 12-minute gaps don't appear by accident in filed reports." "Did you pull the radio logs?" "I requested them. I was told there was a technical issue with the recording system during the operation window, partial capture only." He looked up. Which I also knew, by that point, didn't happen by accident. Lena thought about the radio logs that Garrison had recovered, the ones that contradicted the official record, the ones that contained her objection to the approach vector. "The logs weren't lost," she said. "No, I know that now. I suspected it then, but I couldn't prove it, and I didn't have a named source who could give me a first-person account." He stopped. "And I made a choice. I annotated the commendation document because I needed to put something on record for myself. And then I approved it because I told myself I needed more before I could act. And then the moment was past, and Spears was building on top of it, and every month that went by made it harder to go back without pulling down a significant portion of what had been built on top." He looked at her directly. "That's not an excuse. I want to be clear about that. I'm describing what happened, not explaining why it was acceptable. It wasn't." The lamp in the corner put a limited light over the table and left the walls in shadow, and Lena sat with that for a moment. The specific texture of being told, by someone who had the authority to have stopped it, that they hadn't stopped it, and that they knew they hadn't. "What changed?" she asked. "Garrison called me 4 days ago, before the ceremony. He'd been building the case for 14 months, and he needed the approving authority on the commendation record on the record." Tesh's jaw shifted. "He told me your name. He told me where you were and what you were doing." A pause. "I drove to Denver the same afternoon. I've been at the hotel there since Saturday." She processed this. He'd been 40 miles away during the ceremony, during the Monday meeting, during the drainage ditch and Okafor and the conference room and all of it. "Why didn't Garrison tell me you were there?" she asked. "I asked him not to, not until I could tell you myself." Tesh looked at his hands. "I didn't want it to come through a third party. Whatever I owed you deserved to be direct." It was a strange thing, she thought, to have spent 6 years carrying something and then to have it named accurately in a single conversation by the person who should have named it years ago. The strange thing was that it didn't produce the emotion she might have expected. It produced something more like a structural settling, the sound a building makes when the load shifts to where it should have been all along. "The deposition," she said. "What are you prepared to say?" "Everything, the satellite data discrepancy, my annotation and the reason for it. The fact that I approved a commendation I had substantive reason to doubt." He held her gaze. "And that the absence of your name from that ceremony and from the record that followed was an error of the first order that I had both the authority and the information to correct and did not correct." She nodded. "I'll need you ready by 9 tomorrow morning," she said. "Colonel Mark's team is reconvening at 8. There are JAG officers who'll want to prepare your statement. I'll be there at 7:30. She stood. He stood. He was taller than her by almost a foot, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who had been rehearsing something for 3 hours in a car and had now, arriving at the moment, found that the rehearsed version was inadequate. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know that's not enough." "It's a start," she said. It was the most she could give him honestly, and he accepted it without pushing for more, which was the first genuinely sound decision she'd seen him make. She walked him to the lobby and watched him go out into the parking lot, where a base vehicle was waiting to take him to the officers' quarters. She stood at the glass door for a moment after the car's taillights disappeared. Then she went home, because Marek had told her to sleep, and Marek was correct, and because tomorrow was going to require something she didn't currently have much of. She slept 4 hours, which was not enough, and was also more than she'd expected. She was back at the hospital at 7:15, which gave her 15 minutes before Tesh arrived and 45 before the audit team reconvened, and she used them to find coffee and to sit in the stairwell on the second-floor landing where nobody went at 7 in the morning and let herself be somewhere quiet before the day began. Dax was okay. She'd gotten a message from the K9 facility officer at 6:30, brief, factual, the kind of message someone sends when they've been told to update a person but haven't been told why. Sergeant Major Dax completed overnight observation, no injury, returned to facility kennel at 2100. Behavioral status, normal. She'd read it twice and then held her phone for a moment doing nothing. At 8, the audit team was assembled. By 8:45, General Tesh was formally deposed, and the JAG captain who'd been restrained the previous night was considerably less restrained, and the records specialist Henderson had stopped pretending he wasn't affected by the content of what was being documented. At 9:30, the findings package was complete. Colonel Marek signed the cover page with the unhurried precision of someone who understood that the signature on this particular document would carry weight in processes that hadn't started yet and would take months to conclude. She handed the signed package to the JAG captain without ceremony. "File it," she said. He left. Marek looked at the room. "The formal proceedings against Colonel Spears and Major Callis will be initiated today through the appropriate command authority. Given General Tesh's statement and the evidence package, I expect charges to be brought within 72 hours. She paused. "Dr. Holst is a separate matter. His actions fall under civilian hospital administration oversight rather than military law, but the Inspector General's review will include his role in the administrative leave action and in the characterization of Ms. Whitmore's record to base personnel." Lena was sitting at the far end of the table, which put her at the edge of Marek's address rather than the center of it, which was where she preferred to be. "What about my employment status?" she asked. "The administrative leave is formally rescinded as of this morning. I've submitted a recommendation to the hospital board, not to Holst, to the board directly, which is within my authority under the audit mandate, that your access and standing be fully restored, and that the characterization of your clinical competence in Holst's incident report be formally reviewed." Marek looked at her. "Beyond that, it's a board decision. I can't make it for them." "I understand. What I can tell you," Marek said, is that the board has been informed of the full scope of the investigation and of your role in it. They've also been informed of the Okafor incident and the fence gap and the maintenance delay order, which means they understand that the events of the past week are not a personnel dispute. They're a pattern of misconduct with specific institutional consequences. The room was quiet for a moment. Garrison, who had been standing near the door throughout, looked at his phone. "Holland filed a second motion this morning," he said. "Challenge to the deposition procedure. He's claiming General Tesh wasn't properly notified of his rights as a material witness." "Tesh is a voluntary deponent," the JAG captain said from the doorway. "He'd come back in, file delivered. He waived notification. Holland knows that. He knows that. He's not trying to win the motion. He's trying to establish a record of challenge that could complicate things in 6 months if any of this goes to a formal board hearing." Garrison looked at Marek. "He's playing long game." "So are we," Marek said. "The difference is that our long game has evidence in it." She stood. "We're done here for the morning. I have calls to make. Garrison, I need you at 1400. She picked up her folder and walked out of the conference room with the particular momentum of someone who had a great deal to do and intended to do all of it. The room emptied in her wake. Lena sat for another moment. Henderson, the record specialist, was the last to leave besides her. He was packing his laptop with the careful attention of a man who worked with documents for a living and treated them accordingly. He paused at the door. "The photographs you brought in," he said. "The ones from the field." He stopped, seemed to decide something. "I've processed a lot of evidence packages. In 14 years. He looked at her with a directness that was slightly out of character for someone who'd spent the past 18 hours in the role of careful professional observer. "What you did out there, the surgical intervention on the dog, the intubation in the field, those aren't nursing skills." "No," she said, "they're not." He nodded once, as if confirming something he'd already concluded, and left. The thing about institutional collapse is that it doesn't happen the way it looks in the retelling. It doesn't arrive as a single dramatic moment. It arrives as a series of smaller events that each seem, in isolation, manageable, and then suddenly the weight of all of them together exceeds what the structure can carry. By noon, 3 things had happened in sequence. First, the hospital board convened an emergency session. Lena knew this because Prakash texted her while she was eating a sandwich in the cafeteria. "Board is in session. Nobody's telling us why. Holst hasn't been seen since 9. And because she could feel the specific atmospheric change in a hospital when something administrative was going wrong at the top. The floor staff moved differently. They talked to each other in shorter bursts. The nursing station had the contained energy of people who were processing information they didn't have all the pieces of yet. Second, Colonel Voss was removed from operational command of Silver Creek pending the investigation. She heard this from Garrison. Brief text, no commentary. The executive officer stepping into the role was a lieutenant colonel she didn't know, which meant the command climate of the base had changed in ways that would take time to fully manifest, but that were already changing the air. Third, and this one she watched directly, because she was coming out of the cafeteria when it happened. Holst walked through the main lobby of the hospital at 12:40 with his assistant beside him and a box under his arm. And he walked with the particular stiffness of a man who knew he was being watched and was deciding whether to acknowledge it. He saw her. He stopped. She stopped. The lobby had a moderate amount of foot traffic for a Tuesday midday. Staff, a family near the elevator, a contractor running cable along the far wall. Not empty, not crowded. Holst looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully categorize. It contained anger, but the anger was old now, transformed by the morning into something closer to grievance. The specific grievance of someone who had done what they were told by the people they trusted and was now standing with a box under his arm in a lobby, while the people who told him what to do were separately occupied with their own consequences. "You should know," he said, and his voice was lower than usual, stripped of its administrative texture, "that I was acting on information I was given. I didn't know the full picture." "I know," she said. He seemed to expect more. When it didn't come, something in his posture shifted. Not collapse, not contrition, but a kind of deflation. "I built this department," he said. 12 years. "I know that too." He looked at her for another moment, and then he looked away. And he walked to the exit with his assistant and his box, and went through the glass doors into the midday light. She stood in the lobby and watched him go and felt nothing specific, not satisfaction, not sympathy, just the odd flatness that came after significant things, the way a room feels after furniture has been moved out of it. Callis's full statement reached the JAG team at 2 that afternoon. Garrison summarized it for her in the hospital corridor outside conference room B, standing in the particular posture of someone delivering information rather than having a conversation. Weight forward, voice low, efficient. Callis had given everything. The 2019 record modification, the specific terminal he'd used, the date, the access credentials Spears had provided him, the communications between them over the subsequent 6 years. The directive, issued 3 weeks ago, to delay the east fence repair after Spears informed him that Lena's identity had been confirmed and that the K9 training route represented an opportunity to create an incident. The conversation, 4 days ago, in which Spears had told him the incident needed to happen before the audit team arrived. He said Spears framed it as a training safety issue, Garrison said, made it sound administrative. A handler and dog having an incident on a route with a known gap would generate paperwork, create a distraction, potentially discredit any claims made by a nursing employee who'd already been flagged for inappropriate involvement with the K9 unit. And Okafor was collateral, Lena said. Callis says he didn't know Okafor was going to be hurt. He says the directive was only to delay the repair. He says he didn't know anyone was going to meet Okafor at the fence. Does he know who did? Garrison was quiet for half a second, which was its own answer. Spears made a phone call from his personal cell at 1500 yesterday, he said, before the MPs picked him up. The number traces to a private security contractor, former military, works local. We're looking for him. She processed that. Was the assault on Okafor directed by Spears? We believe so. We're building that part now. The assault charge changed the calculus in a specific way. Record falsification and improper commendation attribution were serious, career-ending, the kind of things that generated board hearings and formal separations. But directing a physical assault against a civilian witness was a different category, and everyone in Garrison's position knew what it meant for the overall case. How is Okafor? She asked. Awake, talking. His wife is with him. Garrison paused. He asked about you, actually. The night security nurse told him who stabilized him in the ditch. She didn't say anything to that. He wants to give a formal statement, Garrison continued, as soon as he's cleared by Solis. Good. She went to the nursing floor because the administrative leave was rescinded and she had a shift to cover and the floor was short-staffed, and that was, in the most basic sense, why she was employed here. She changed into clean scrubs. She went to the nursing station and looked at the board. Patrice Doyle was not there. The floor coordinator, a charge nurse named Esperanza, who had always treated Lena with the specific professional respect that competent nurses extended to other competent nurses, regardless of what the administrative hierarchy suggested, handed her a patient list without comment. We have a post-op in room 12 who's been asking for someone all morning, Esperanza said, and a new admit in 8 trauma from the training exercise yesterday, hand injury. I'll start with 12, Lena said. She spent the next 3 hours doing her job, which was the most clarifying thing she'd done all week. The post-op patient in room 12 was a 40-year-old soldier named Gareth, who'd had an appendectomy 2 days prior and was experiencing the particular existential difficulty of enforced inactivity, and Lena sat with him for 20 minutes after his assessment and let him talk about his daughter's soccer tournament that he was going to miss. And she didn't offer solutions because there weren't any, and he looked slightly less tightly wound when she left than when she'd come in. The hand injury in room 8 was a younger soldier, a specialist, early 20s, who'd caught 2 fingers in a piece of equipment during the training exercise. No fractures, but significant soft tissue damage, and the kind of expression that said he was managing his pain with the specific pride of someone who didn't want to admit how much things hurt. You can ask for pain management, she told him. It's not optional, it's part of treatment. I'm fine, he said. You're not fine. Your fingers are the size of sausages, and you've been holding your hand at a specific angle for the past hour because it hurts less that way. Ask for the medication. He looked at her. Please, she added. It helps the healing, not a suggestion. He asked. She updated his chart, filed the assessment, and moved to the next room. At 4:30, Esperanza appeared in the doorway of the supply room where Lena was doing inventory restock. Board made an announcement, she said. Posted to the staff portal 10 minutes ago. Lena kept restocking. They accepted Holst's resignation effective immediately and appointed an interim director from the regional medical command. They also... Esperanza paused. There's a formal statement about the administrative leave action. It says it was issued improperly and without adequate basis, and that the record of it will be expunged. Lena put a box of IV tubing on the shelf. Okay, she said. Esperanza was quiet for a moment. Is that all you've got? I'm doing inventory. Lena. She stopped and looked at Esperanza, who was watching her with the particular warmth of someone who had known, the way floor nurses often know things before anyone puts them in writing, that something had been wrong for a while and was now less wrong. Okay, Lena said, and this time there was something slightly different in it. Not celebration, not vindication, just the solid, factual acknowledgement of a thing having shifted. It's good. It's what should have happened. Esperanza nodded and left her to the inventory. At 6 in the evening, Garrison appeared on the nursing floor, which was the kind of thing that didn't happen without a reason. She saw him from the end of the corridor and walked toward him. Spears wants to talk, he said, before she reached him. She stopped. His attorney has proposed a proffer session, Garrison continued. Spears offers information in exchange for consideration on the charging decision. Holland is angling for a plea framework. What information? Holland says it's relevant to the records modification and also to... Garrison paused in the specific way he paused when he was deciding how to frame something. There's apparently a third party, someone outside the base who was involved in the record management process in 2019. What does that mean? It means the falsification of your service record may not have been limited to the base system. There may be a federal records component that Spears is prepared to detail in exchange for the plea consideration. He looked at her steadily. If there's a federal element, the exposure is significantly wider than what we've been looking at. She thought about that. 3 years of building a quiet life in the shadow of a thing she couldn't fully see. 6 years of a wrong she'd carried in a waterproof envelope in a hall closet. And now Spears, backed into a corner with a falsified commendation and an assault charge and a communications record that left no interpretive wiggle room, was offering to show her something she hadn't known was there. What do you need from me? She asked. Nothing right now. The proffer session is tomorrow. I wanted you to know it was happening and what it might mean before you heard it from someone else. She nodded. Does Marek know? Marek called me 20 minutes ago. She's cautiously interested. He tilted his head slightly. She said to tell you that whatever Spears is holding, it doesn't change what we have. The case is solid without it. But it could make it wider. Yes. She looked down the corridor at the nursing station, at Esperanza talking to a resident, at the ordinary industry of a clinical floor at early evening. Keep me informed, she said. Garrison left. She finished her shift. What? At 8:47 in the evening, she was writing notes in the charting system at the nursing station when her phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't have saved. It was a photograph. No text, no caption, just an image. It took her a moment to understand what she was looking at. It was a personnel file page. Her personnel file, her original service record, the one that should have listed her as primary on Keldara Forward. She recognized the document structure, the header fields, the classification markers. But this version was different from the one in the base records. This one had her name listed correctly, with the primary designation intact. It had a date of March 14, 2019. It had a digital certification stamp at the bottom. The stamp was from the Defense Records Management Agency's Federal Archive System. Her original record hadn't been deleted. It had been moved. Someone, in March 2019, had transferred the original authenticated file to a federal archive with a different access tier, so not to destroy it, but to bury it somewhere that the base system wouldn't find it in a standard records pull. Buried it, and apparently left it there, certified and time-stamped, for 6 years. Her hands were very still on the keyboard. She looked at the number the message had come from. Unknown. A number with a Colorado prefix. She called it back. 1 ring, 2. A voice she didn't recognize, young, male, the specific tight quality of someone doing something they'd decided to do but hadn't fully committed to yet. I'm a records clerk at the DRMA regional office in Colorado Springs, he said. I've been trying to decide whether to make this call for 3 days. I saw the audit flag on the file this morning, and He stopped. I've known that file was there for 8 months. I found it when I was doing an archive reorganization. I ran the primary name and it came back clean in the current system, which meant nobody was looking for it because they didn't know it existed. Why are you calling me? She said. Because the flag went on this morning and I know what that means. And because whoever buried the original record did it without proper authority, and Another stop. I should have reported it when I found it. I didn't because I didn't understand what I was looking at. I understand it now. What's your name? She asked. A pause. Aldwin, he said. My name is Aldwin Prue. She looked at the photograph on her phone screen. Her name, her record. Intact, certified, archived, buried, and now found. Mr. Prue, she said, I need you to call a man named Garrison tonight. I'm going to give you his number, and I need you to tell him exactly what you told me, and I need you to not close that archive file until someone from the Inspector General's office has been able to access it. Can you do that? Yes, he said, with the sound of someone who has been waiting to do the right thing long enough that it had gotten heavy. Good. She gave him the number. Call him now, not in the morning. Now. She ended the call. She looked at the nursing station, at the chart open in front of her, at the fluorescent light above the desk with its familiar incomplete flicker. Her original service record was in a federal archive in Colorado Springs, certified and time-stamped and untouched, waiting with the patient indifference of documents for someone to come and find it. And Spears, in whatever room he was sitting in tonight with his attorney and his proffer proposal, had just run out of the one thing he'd had left. He'd had 6 years of a wrong that existed only in her account versus his, only in a waterproof envelope and a field notebook and a dog's memory. Not anymore. She picked up her phone and called Garrison. He answered on the first ring. I know, he said before she could speak. Prue just called me. I'm already moving. The record in the archive is authentic. Henderson confirmed the certification stamp format in under 3 minutes. A sound in the background. Movement. People. Lena, it's his handwriting. The transfer authorization. On the archive intake form, whoever moved that file signed the intake form, and it's Spears' signature. She sat with that. Spears had moved the file himself, hadn't deleted it, moved it, signed the intake form, put his name on the act of burying her record in a federal archive. Either he'd been careless, or he'd been arrogant, or he'd believed that the archive tier was inaccessible enough that the signature would never matter. He'd been wrong about that. The assault charge, the record falsification, and now a federal archive access violation with his signature on it, she said. Yes, Garrison said. Holland is going to have a very interesting morning. She heard him moving, a door, voices. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow is going to be significant. She ended the call. She sat at the nursing station for another moment, in the familiar evening light of a hospital floor, with the monitor sounds and the low voices and the ordinary functioning of a place that existed to help people get through the worst days of their lives. Tomorrow would be significant. But tonight, for the first time in 6 years, every piece of what had happened existed somewhere outside her own memory. Documented, certified, archived, signed by the man who tried to make it disappear. She picked up her pen and went back to her charts, because there were patients who needed accurate records, and that, in the end, was what she had always been here to do. She finished her charts at 9:43 and drove home through the dark Colorado streets with the windows down, because the cold air was the only thing that felt proportionate to everything the day had contained. She didn't sleep immediately. She sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and let the events arrange themselves in the order they'd happened, which was something she'd always done after significant operational periods. Not to process emotion exactly, but to establish sequence, to make sure she understood what had actually occurred versus what she'd anticipated or feared. The two were often different, and the difference mattered. What had actually occurred: Spears' signature on a federal archive intake form. Her original service record, intact, certified, 6 years dormant, in a system 1 tier above where anyone had thought to look. What it meant: the proffer session Holland had proposed would change character entirely by morning. You didn't offer information in exchange for plea consideration when the information you were withholding had just been found without you. She went to bed at 11. She set no alarm, which was unusual, and slept until 6:15, which was the longest uninterrupted stretch she'd managed in years. The proffer session happened at 9. in a JAG conference facility on the base that was used specifically for legal proceedings and had the particular sterile quality of rooms designed to contain significant things without absorbing them. Lena was not in the room. She was in a smaller office 2 doors down, where Garrison had set up a second audio feed with Marek's authorization, because she was a primary party and had the right to know in real time what was being said. She heard Holland's voice first, controlled, the professional smoothness of a man who charged significant hourly rates to sound untroubled. He outlined Spears' cooperation framework. Spears would provide a full accounting of the Keldara after-action modification, the communications with Callis, and the third-party records management arrangement that had resulted in the archive transfer. In exchange, the prosecution would consider reduced charging on the conspiracy elements. Marek's voice was level and contained exactly 0 warmth. Counselor, before your client begins, I want you to be aware of a development from last night. A pause. The file your client moved to the Federal Archive in March 2019 was located yesterday evening. The archive intake form carries your client's signature. Chain of custody is intact and has been verified by the Defense Records Management Agency. Another pause. The third-party information your client was proposing to offer is no longer leverage. We have the record, and we have his name on the document that moved it. The silence that followed lasted long enough to be its own kind of statement. When Holland spoke again, the professional smoothness had developed a hairline fracture. I'll need to confer with my client. You have 15 minutes, Marek said. Lena sat in the small office and looked at a water stain on the ceiling that was roughly the shape of the state of Colorado, and thought about Roland Spears in a room 2 doors down, having 15 minutes to decide what he had left to offer, and finding that the inventory was considerably shorter than it had been 12 hours ago. The 15 minutes took 11. Holland's voice returned. My client will provide a full accounting, no conditions. That's the correct decision, Marek said. We'll begin. Spears talked for 2 hours and 40 minutes. She didn't listen to all of it. She listened to the parts that were about her. The initial decision in March 2019, the specific reasoning Spears gave for transferring the file rather than deleting it, which turned out to be exactly the kind of arrogance she'd half suspected. He'd believed the archive tier was forensically inaccessible without a specific flag code that only 3 people in the Regional Records Command knew, and he'd signed the intake form because the archive facility required a signature, and he hadn't considered that the signature itself was documentation of the act. He'd buried her record and written his name on the shovel. She listened to the part about Callis, about the 6 years of communication, about the ceremony and the background pull and the decision to use the fence gap. She did not listen to the part about the assault on Okafor. She stepped out of the office and stood in the hallway for that section, because there were things she could absorb and things she'd process better after the fact, and that was one of the latter. She went back in when Garrison appeared at the door and nodded. She listened to the end. Spears' voice, when he spoke directly rather than through Holland, was different from the voice she remembered from 2019. Not the confident command register she'd heard in briefings, in the field, in the moment when he'd looked across a room at her and said her contract was not being renewed. It was flatter now. The specific flatness of someone who has decided to be truthful about things they've spent years being untruthful about, and is discovering that truth at this stage is not relief. It's just the next thing that has to happen. She was primary, he said, at one point, answering a direct question from the JAG captain. On the approach decision, on the medical response. Both. Reyes would have died without her intervention. The asset would not have been recovered with the approach vector I filed. Why did you alter the record? A silence that lasted about 4 seconds. Because I'd been in the field for 11 years, and I'd made good calls and bad calls, and that mission was the one where someone beside me made the better call under fire, and He stopped. Started again with less. Because I could. And because I'd already started telling it differently before I understood what I was doing, and by the time I understood, it felt like it was too late to go back. Was Mrs. Whitmore informed of the modification? No. Did you anticipate she would surface it? I anticipated she'd try. I didn't think she could. A pause. I was wrong about that. Lena sat in the small office and listened to Roland Spears say the things she'd needed someone in authority to say for 6 years, and she noted with the detached accuracy she'd always applied to her own emotional states that it didn't feel the way she'd imagined it would. It felt smaller than she'd expected, and more complete, like the last entry in a log that had been running too long. She walked out before the session formally closed. The charging documents were filed at 2 in the afternoon. Colonel Roland Spears, falsification of a classified military record, improper appropriation of a commendation, Federal Archive access violation, conspiracy to commit witness intimidation, and what's, based on the evidence developed overnight, directing the physical assault of a civilian witness. 6 counts, the kind of count sheet that ended careers before the first hearing date. Major Denton Callas, conspiracy to falsify military records, deliberate neglect of a safety maintenance directive in furtherance of harm, accessory to witness intimidation. 4 counts, with Callas's cooperation agreement noted in the filing, which would affect sentencing, but not the record. The charges against both men were public record the moment they were filed, which meant by 3 o'clock they had circulated through the base with the speed that information circulated in institutions where everyone knew everyone. Lena heard about it from Prakash, who appeared in the doorway of the medication room where she was reconciling a supply discrepancy with the focus of someone who needed to be doing something concrete. "It's out," he said. "I know." 6 counts, he leaned against the doorframe. "Assault." "Okafor's going to be okay," she said, "because of you." She checked the supply log against the shelf count. "Because Dax found him and I happened to be the person who followed the dog." Prakash was quiet for a moment. "You know, I've been thinking about something since Monday, when you told me to tell people what I observed, not what I assumed. Yeah. I observed for 2 years a nurse who consistently made the right clinical call before the resident had finished processing the situation, who moved in an emergency like someone who'd done it somewhere significantly more complicated than a hospital floor." He looked at her. "I made assumptions about why. The assumptions were smaller than the reality." She looked up from the supply log. "I'm sorry," he said, "for not asking more directly." "You treated me like a colleague," she said. "That's not something to apologize for." He nodded, accepted this, and left her to the inventory. Ferris Okafor was moved from the ICU to a recovery room on the 3rd floor at 4 in the afternoon. She went up at the end of her shift. His wife, a tall woman named Delphine, who had the particular composure of someone who had spent the last 24 hours terrified and was now on the other side of it and running on something close to empty, was in the chair beside the bed. Okafor himself was awake, propped slightly, with the careful stillness of a man managing a head that still hurt significantly. He looked at Lena when she came in, and his expression did something uncomplicated and direct. "You're the one from the ditch," he said. "Lena Whitmore." "Ferris," he gestured at his wife. "Del." He looked at Lena with the directness of a man who processed things practically. "The dog found me?" He flagged something in the brush. I followed him. "I've been on this base for 6 years, Okafor said. "I've walked past that K9 facility 100 times. Never thought much about it." He shifted slightly, winced, adjusted. "I filed that complaint because I thought someone should know about the fence. I didn't think—" He stopped. "I didn't understand what I'd walked into." "You understood enough to go document it," she said. "That took something." "I almost didn't." He said it plainly, without drama. "I sat in my truck for 20 minutes before I got out." "Most people don't get out," she said. "You did." His wife Delphine looked at Lena with the expression of someone who had things she wanted to say and was deciding whether this was the moment. She decided it was. "Thank you," she said. "That's not enough, but it's what I have." "It's enough," Lena said. She left them with their evening. The formal hearing process would take months. That was the nature of military law, and of federal charges, and of institutional accountability that actually meant something rather than the kind that got filed and forgotten. Garrison told her this on Wednesday morning over coffee at Teller's. The same table, different light, the October sun at a different angle through the corner windows. "The proceedings against Spears will likely take 6 to 8 months to reach a formal board," he said. "Callas's cooperation agreement will move faster. Tesh's deposition is a central document in both." "And the base?" she asked. "Colonel Voss is under separate review for his role in the personnel background poll and his communication with Holst about the administrative leave. The review will determine whether it rises to the level of misconduct or falls under the category of acting on information from a superior officer. He looked at his coffee. My personal read is that Voss believed he was doing the right thing and was wrong in a way that doesn't entirely excuse him. What about Holst? The Civilian Oversight Board has his resignation and the IG report. They'll determine whether the administrative leave action rises to actionable misconduct. The board is apparently also reviewing several other personnel decisions he made over the past 2 years. Garrison looked at her. The interim director has already reversed 3 of them. She thought about Holst in the lobby with his box. I built this department. 12 years. She thought about what it meant to build something and to have the building be real. The department was real, the years of work were real, and to have it also be true that some of what held it together was wrong. Both things could be simultaneously accurate. That was one of the things she'd learned in the 6 years since Keldara, that people were rarely entirely one thing, and that the complicated ones were the hardest to be angry at cleanly, and that the inability to be angry at them cleanly didn't mean what they'd done was acceptable. What happens to my record? She asked. Garrison reached into his folder and produced a document. He put it on the table without making a ceremony of it, because he was the kind of person who understood that ceremonies were sometimes less respectful than straightforwardness. It was a formal record correction notice from the Defense Records Management Agency. Her name, her service designation, her rank at separation. The Keldara Forward Mission listing, with her designation corrected from supporting personnel to primary medical responder and field team lead. The after-action record, amended. The commendation record, flagged for formal review with a notation referencing the IG findings. At the bottom, a certification signature, General Warren Tesh. She looked at it for a long moment. He requested to sign it himself, Garrison said. Marek said it was procedurally appropriate given his role as the original approving authority. She folded the document carefully and put it in her jacket pocket. Not the waterproof envelope, that was for things she needed to protect. This was different. This was something she was going to keep close. What does this mean for the commendation? She asked. Spear's commendation is being formally reviewed and will almost certainly be rescinded pending the board findings. The question of whether a commendation should be reissued for Keldara Forward, and to whom, is a separate process that Marek has recommended be initiated. He paused. You don't have to engage with that process if you don't want to. The record correction stands regardless. She thought about that. She thought about whether she wanted a commendation, which was a more complicated question than it sounded. She decided she'd answer it when it was asked formally, and not before. There's something else, Garrison said. He pulled out a second document, different format, different letterhead. The interim director of Silver Creek submitted a request to the Regional Medical Command yesterday. Given the circumstances and the clinical record that's emerged from the investigation, he's recommending a reclassification of your position at the hospital. She looked at him. He wants to establish a trauma specialist role with oversight of both clinical floor protocols and canine medical support integration for the base. He's specifically requesting you for it. Garrison looked at the document. It's a new position. Nobody's held it before. The job description is essentially built around what you've been doing informally for 3 years, plus what the records show you're actually qualified to do. That's a significant position, she said. Yes. He doesn't know me. He knows your record, the real one. Garrison looked at her steadily. He also talked to Prakash, and Esperanza, and Solis, and the security sergeant from the East Access Road. He paused. And to Briggs. She was quiet. What did Briggs say? She asked. He said, Garrison glanced at his notes, which she understood was less because he needed them and more because he wanted to get the phrasing right. He said she talked to the dog like she understood what the dog was saying, and that in his experience, that was not something you could fake. She looked out the window of tellers at the main road, and the October morning, and the mountains behind everything, patient and enormous. I'll need to think about it, she said. That's the right answer, Garrison said. Take the time. She took 4 days. She ran the Foothills Trail twice, went to the hospital and did her regular shifts, sat with Okafor when he was well enough for conversation, and visited the canine facility once, officially, with a visitor pass and a purpose, because the facility officer had asked if she'd be willing to consult on Dax's ongoing care protocol given the aging presentation she'd noted at the ceremony. She said yes to that one immediately. Dax was in the exercise yard when she arrived, moving at the careful trot of an old dog who'd decided that deliberate was better than fast, which was a decision she had some personal experience with. He saw her from across the yard and his ears came up and his tail moved in the slow, certain way it always had. Not frantic, not performative, just present. She sat on the ground because that was where he was, and he came and pressed his head into her lap, which was not standard canine protocol, and which neither of them cared about. She ran her hands over him the way she always did. Systematic, thorough, reading him the way she'd always been able to read him. His muscle tone was reduced from what it had been. His coat was still good. The scar on his ear was the same. His breathing was even. He was old. He'd been in the field for 11 years, and he'd taken injuries, and he'd done his job with the complete commitment that working dogs gave to the thing they were trained for, which was everything they had. "Good boy," she said, in Czech, which was the language he knew, and he pressed harder into her hands. She stayed for 40 minutes. On the way out, the facility officer, a young sergeant named Tully, who'd been working canine support for 2 years, and had the specific combination of technical knowledge and genuine affection for the animals that made someone good at the job, stopped her near the gate. "Ma'am," he said, "I know you're considering the specialist position. Word travels." "Yes, ma'am." He looked at Dax, who was lying in the sun near the fence. "I wanted you to know, from a canine care perspective, that having someone on the medical side who actually understands the animals would change how we work. The current protocol is good on paper and not always right in practice. We lose things because the clinical staff and the canine team don't speak the same language." She looked at him. He was young enough to be her junior soldier from another life. "I know," she said. "I've noticed." "The dogs noticed too," he said, and glanced at Dax again. "Just my observation." She thanked him and left. She accepted the position on Saturday morning. She sent the reply to the interim director's office email directly, 3 sentences, no preamble. She would accept the trauma specialist and canine integration role subject to a formal contract review. She wanted 60 days to assess and propose a protocol revision for the canine clinical interface. And she required that Sergeant Tully be included in the development process because he understood the operational side better than the current documentation reflected. The interim director replied in 11 minutes. Agreed on all 3 points. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Whitmore." Or, "What do your colleagues call you?" She looked at the question for a moment. "Lena," she typed back. "Most of them." She put the phone down and made coffee and stood at her kitchen window looking at the foothills. The record correction notice was on the kitchen counter, unfolded. She'd taken it out of her pocket the first night and left it there, not displayed, not framed, just present. The way you leave something in a place where you can see it while you do ordinary things, until the reality of it becomes part of the background rather than the foreground. She looked at it the way she'd been looking at it for 4 days. Her name, the correct designation, the timestamp that said this had always been true, even when the documents said otherwise. The formal board proceedings against Spears began 7 weeks later, on a Tuesday in late November. She was not required to attend every session. Her deposition and statement had been formally entered into the record, and the JAG team had what they needed. But she attended the opening session because there are things you witness in person, not because you have to, but because the act of witnessing matters. The proceeding was held in a formal hearing room on the base, the kind with a raised bench and a long table and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look equally tired. There were perhaps 30 people present, legal personnel, witnesses in waiting, several officers she recognized and several she didn't. Garrison was near the back. Marek was at the front in her formal uniform. Spears came in with Hollin and 2 other attorneys, and he sat at the respondents' table and looked at the bench and looked at his hands and did not look at the room. He was in uniform, which was technically still his right pending the formal board decision, but the uniform looked different on him now, not because anything about the fabric or the cut had changed, but because the things it represented had shifted, and some of that was visible in the way he wore it. She sat in the 3rd row. She watched the charges read aloud by the presiding officer, a full general from the Inspector General's command, with the flat, deliberate voice of someone who understood that the words had specific legal weight and should be given their proper mass. 6 counts. The record falsification, the commendation impropriety, the archive violation, the conspiracy, the assault direction. She watched Spears' face as each count was read. She'd thought, In the years when she'd imagined this moment, that she would feel something clean, something like justice arriving with a fanfare. But what she felt was quieter and harder to name, closer to the feeling she had when a patient stabilized after a long, uncertain night. Not triumph, just the resumption of how things should have been. After the charges were read and the respondent's plea was entered, not guilty on all counts, which surprised no one, Holland was playing procedure. The presiding officer recessed for 30 minutes. People moved. The room reorganized. General Tesh appeared beside her, which she had not expected. He moved with the careful deliberateness of a large old man navigating a crowded room, and he sat down next to her without waiting to be invited. They didn't speak for a moment. "How are you doing?" he asked. It was such a human question that it caught her slightly off guard. Not a procedural question, not a legal question, just the simple inquiry of one person to another in a difficult room. "I'm okay," she said. Then, more accurately, "I'm getting there." He nodded. He looked at the front of the room where Spears was in conference with Holland. "I've testified at a lot of proceedings," he said. "I've never testified at one where I was part of what needed to be corrected." "How was it?" "Uncomfortable," he said. "Which is appropriate." He looked at her. "I saw your appointment was announced. The specialist position." "It was announced?" "Base newsletter. The interim director appears to be enthusiastic. Something in his expression that was close to dry. He described the role as filling a critical institutional gap in trauma and canine medical integration. He also noted your operational background, which I understand is now correctly documented." "It is," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Is the role what you want?" She thought about that. Not about the title, not about what it meant for the record or the narrative or the accounting of 6 years, but about the actual work. The canine facility and Tully and Dax in the exercise yard, and the trauma floor and Okafor's charts, and the soldier in room 8 who'd needed someone to tell him that asking for pain management wasn't weakness. "Yes," she said. "It's exactly what I want." He nodded, and something in his posture eased slightly, like a weight that had been sitting on him at a specific angle had shifted. The recess ended. The room reassembled. She stayed for the afternoon session and left at 4, walking out of the hearing building into a November afternoon that was cold and gray and smelled like snow coming. The mountains were mostly obscured by cloud, just the lower slopes visible, the tops gone into the weather. She walked to her car. Her phone had 3 messages, 2 from Garrison, procedural updates she'd read later, and 1 from Tully, at the canine facility. Dax had his follow-up evaluation today. "Vet says his joint pain is manageable with the new supplement protocol you recommended. He ate his whole dinner. Thought you'd want to know." She read it twice. She stood in the parking lot in the gray November cold and felt something that was not complicated and did not require analysis. Just simple, uncomplicated warmth, the kind that came from an old dog eating his dinner. She drove back to the hospital. 3 months later, in February. The month that held Keldara forward in its calendar like a stone in a pocket. The board issued its findings. Roland Spears, guilty on 5 of 6 counts. The 6th, the assault direction charge, was guilty on a lesser count due to an evidentiary limitation the JAG team had anticipated. His rank was formally stripped. His commendation was rescinded. His service record was amended to reflect the board's findings, which would follow him into every civilian context where his military background was presented or claimed. He was separated from service, not honorably. Denton Callis, guilty on 3 counts, reduced from 4 under the cooperation agreement. Separated. No criminal prosecution on the conspiracy element in exchange for the full statement, which had been instrumental in the Spears proceedings. Holst's civilian review had concluded in January. Findings: improper personnel action, failure of due diligence in the administrative leave decision, insufficient investigation before acting on third-party characterizations of an employee's record. He would not face criminal charges. He had, however, already resigned, and the board's findings would be permanent record in the hospital's administrative history. Voss received a formal reprimand and was transferred to a non-command administrative role at a different facility. It was a softer outcome than some people thought appropriate, and Lena was one of them, but she understood that institutional accountability produced a range of outcomes, and that the range was sometimes frustrating, and also sometimes the difference between a system that could self-correct and one that couldn't. She read the findings in the break room at 6:30 in the morning over her first coffee of the day, with Esperanza across the table doing the same. Esperanza set her phone down. "How do you feel?" "Tired," Lena said. "And okay." Both at once. Usually. Esperanza looked at her with the directness of someone who had known her long enough to say the thing. "You know what I noticed the whole time, when everything was happening?" "What?" "You kept showing up for your patients." Esperanza picked up her coffee. "Gareth in room 12. The kid with the fingers. Okafor. You kept doing the work the whole time the world was falling apart around you." She paused. "That's not nothing. Most people would have—" "It was something to do," Lena said. "It was more than that." Lena thought about it. She thought about why she'd kept coming to the floor, kept reconciling supply logs and checking vitals, and sitting with people in the particular darkness of a hospital room at night when the fear was loudest. "It's the only place where the job is clear," she said. "In the room, with a patient. You know what you're trying to do. You know if you're doing it." She held her coffee cup. "Outside the room, everything's complicated. Inside it, it's just, what does this person need and can I help?" Esperanza nodded slowly. "That's why you're good at it." "I'm adequate at it," Lena said. "I'm still learning the parts I missed by being elsewhere for years." Esperanza smiled at that, and they sat in the break room with their coffee while the morning shift came in around them. The daily industry of a hospital floor beginning its cycle with the specific faithfulness of things that don't stop because the world outside is complicated. In March, on a day that came in warm after a cold February, the base held a formal ceremony in the Silver Creek Military Medical Center main hall. It was smaller than the retirement ceremony in October. Deliberate in its scale, Marek had recommended against anything large, on the grounds that the purpose was accuracy rather than spectacle, and that accuracy didn't require an audience of hundreds to be real. About 60 people. The audit team, the JAG officers, the interim director. Garrison, in the back, with his characteristic quality of witnessing without participating. Prakash, who had come in on his day off. Esperanza and 2 other nurses from the floor. Tully from the K9 facility. Briggs, who was walking again without a brace and had asked Tully 3 times if he could come. Okafor and Delphine, Okafor still moving carefully but present and deliberate. General Tesh, in the front row. Colonel Marek stood at the front. "The purpose of this ceremony," she said, "is to formally acknowledge a correction to the record and to the institutional memory of this command. Not to celebrate, exactly. Celebration implies the situation was resolved in a way that's fully satisfying, and I think everyone in this room understands that what happened here was costly in ways that don't entirely resolve." She looked at the room. "But acknowledgement is different from celebration. Acknowledgement is a form of accuracy, and accuracy, in military medicine and in military service, is not optional." She read the formal record correction into the ceremony proceedings. Lena's name, her designation, the Keldara forward mission, the corrected record. She read it in full, without abbreviation, which meant every word that had been wrong for 6 years was said correctly, in the presence of witnesses, into a document that would be part of the institutional record of Silver Creek Military Medical Center going forward. When she finished, she looked at Lena. "Ms. Whitmore," she said, "on behalf of this command." The room stood, not at a command, not on a signal, just stood, in the way people stand when something true happens in a room, and the standing is the most honest response available. Lena stood at the front of the room and looked at the people standing for her, and she felt the complexity of it without trying to simplify it. The years it had taken, the cost of those years, the things that were genuinely better now, and the things that would always carry the mark of having been wrong. She felt Tesh in the front row, standing with the others, carrying the weight of his own part in it. She felt the ordinary imperfection of all of it, the fact that Spears was separated but not imprisoned, that Voss had gotten a transfer rather than a reprimand that matched the damage, that 6 years couldn't be given back. She felt all of that, and she also felt something underneath it that wasn't about any of those specific things. She thought about the morning she'd taken the Silver Creek position, standing in the HR office with a badge that said, "Nursing staff" in block letters, deciding to be small because small was safe. She thought about 3 years of carrying a waterproof envelope in a hall closet, which was not the same thing as giving up, but was also not the same thing as living without the weight. She thought about an old Belgian Malinois crossing a ceremony ground with the absolute certainty of an animal who doesn't negotiate with institutional memory, who simply recognizes what is real. She thought about Briggs in the grass with his twisted knee saying he went through the fence, and about cold ditch water and Okafor's unequal pupils, and about Aldwin Prue sitting in his truck for 20 minutes before he got out to make the call, which was the bravest small thing she'd heard about in a week full of large ones. She thought about the break room and Esperanza's question and her own answer, which she still believed. It's the only place where the job is clear. That was still true. It would remain true. Thank you, she said, to the room, to all of it. The acknowledgement and the correction, and the imperfect, incomplete, satisfying, real fact of it. The room sat back down. Marek nodded at her, once, the nod of one person to another who has both done what needed doing. After the ceremony, most people moved to the adjacent room where someone had organized food and coffee and the kind of informal gathering that followed formal things. Lena went outside. The March day was clear and the mountains were visible all the way to the upper peaks. The winter snow still on them, but the lower slopes going soft with the beginning of the season's turn. The air was cold and clean, and the sky was that particular high-altitude blue that meant visibility for 50 miles. She heard the door behind her. Dax came around the side of the building at Tully's heel, because Tully had apparently decided that the ceremony was the kind of occasion that warranted bringing the dog. And nobody had told him otherwise, and he was right. Dax saw her and came to her at the careful trot that was all his joints allowed now. And she crouched down and put her hands on him, and he pressed into her the way he always had, with the complete, uncomplicated certainty of an animal who knew what he knew and didn't require anyone to confirm it. He smelled like dog and dry Colorado grass and the particular warmth of an old animal in the sun. "Good boy," she said. She stayed crouched there for a long moment, her hands on an old dog who had found her in a crowd before anyone else knew to look, who had flagged a gap in a fence and an unconscious man in a ditch, and had come back through a fence hole in the dark at the sound of a voice speaking in the right language, who had, from the beginning to the end of this, known exactly who she was. There is something about being recognized, not celebrated, not rewarded, not promoted, just recognized. Seen accurately by something that cannot lie about what it perceives before any official document confirms it. 6 years ago, the institution had looked at what she'd done in a cold forward operating base and decided it was more convenient to attribute it elsewhere. 6 years ago, she'd accepted the limits of what she could fight with the tools she had, and she'd built a parallel life, and she'd carried what she couldn't put down. And she'd waited. She hadn't waited because she was patient. She wasn't naturally patient. She'd waited because that was what the situation required. And she'd done what the situation required, and she'd done it while continuing to show up to work every day and do her job, which was an unremarkable form of persistence that nobody would make a ceremony about, and which was, in her experience, the thing that actually got people through. The quiet ones don't win because they're quiet. They win because they don't stop. Because they know what they know, and they continue to know it regardless of what the documents say, and they keep their evidence in a waterproof envelope in a hall closet, and they follow the dog when the dog finds something, and they go into the ditch when there's someone in it. That's not strength as an aesthetic. That's strength as a practice, day by day, in the conditions that actually exist, which are never the conditions you'd have chosen. She had not gotten justice by being perfect. She'd gotten it by being persistent and by being honest, and by refusing to simplify what was complicated, including herself. Including the people who'd wronged her, which was harder than hating them cleanly and also more accurate. She straightened up. Dax looked at her with his old eyes in the March sun, and she looked back, and between them was everything that didn't need to be said because it had already been demonstrated in a forward operating base in February 2019, and in a ceremony ground in October, and in a drainage ditch in October again, and in every ordinary day between those extraordinary ones. "Come on," she said in Czech. She walked back toward the building. Dax walked beside her, matching her pace, his shoulder against her leg. Not because she'd commanded it, but because that was where he was, and where he intended to stay, for whatever time they both had left in this place. The door opened. The sound of people and coffee and the ordinary warmth of a room full of humans doing the human thing of gathering after something significant came out to meet her. She went in.